The hooves come first, not in war, not in fury, but in rhythm. A soft drumming that builds in the bones of the earth long before it's heard in the ears. They ripple across the winter-blanched steppe, across plains dusted in icy gold, beneath skies so wide they seem to swallow thought. A wool-lined saddle creaks. Snow hisses under a horse's breath. This is not yet empire. This is silence. Bitter and open and old. And here, across this silence, the riders moved long before they conquered herding, hunting, listening to the cry of eagles. This land, so severe and elemental, had always bred a particular kind of strength, the kind that learned patience from the seasons and mercy from hunger. In winter, the steppe gave nothing. Grass shriveled to brittle stalks. The animals wandered far or died quietly in their skins. People stayed close to fire and fleece. Families huddled in circular gurs, their round wool tents pressed low against the wind. Every breath inside smelled of horse sweat, boiled mutton, and sour milk. Ice formed around the edges of shared bowls. The fire in the center flickered blue. Children here didn't grow soft. They rode before they could walk straight. They knocked arrows as soon as their fingers could bend. Boys were taught to judge the wind by taste, to track prey without sight, to sing to their horses in the dark. Girls milked mares in the half-light and spun wool by firelight. Learned to fight beside brothers if the camp was raided. To be born on the steppe was to be born to motion and struggle. Wrapped in felt, bound to the back of a horse, there was no permanence here, only weather, and the knowledge that everything could vanish by morning. Yet despite the cold and hardship, there was peace in the cycles. The clans moved with their herds from river to ridge, never staying too long, never building beyond what could be packed onto a cart. Their world had no roads, no walls, no stones, only sky above, hoofprints below, and the stories sung in the long nights. The world of the Mongol steppe was not empty, it was full of movement. Hawks circling above, herds pulsing across the land like tides, words passed down through breath, not books. In this world, memory mattered more than writing. An insult could last generations. An oath, once spoken, echoed like thunder across lifetimes. The lineages of each clan were recited like poems: who married whom, who betrayed whom, who had stolen horses, and who had returned them with interest. And among these families, scattered like constellations across the plain, one boy would be born who remembered the cold more sharply than the rest. They called him Temujin. He was born near the Onon River, sometime in the early 1162nd, during a time when even the stars seemed uncertain. His father, Yezugai, was a chieftain of a minor clan, and his mother, Hoilun, had once been stolen from another tribe. That's how alliances were made here, through raids and retaliation, through marriages sealed by force and necessity. Temujin's birth came not with fanfare, but with blood and chill. He was named for a Tatar enemy his father had recently killed. Even as a child, Temujin's life was wrapped in the same raw fabric that covered the land. He played with arrows and flint. He drank fermented mare's milk before his teeth had finished coming in. But it was not a happy or noble childhood. His family was betrayed when he was still a boy. His father was poisoned by rival Tatars, and their small group was cast out, abandoned, starving, stripped of status. No one would trade with them. Other clans closed their fires to them. Temujin, his mother, and his siblings survived on roots, rodents, and wild fruit. scraping meals from frozen hillsides. It is said that they once boiled horse bones for days, hoping for some trace of fat. That Temujin hunted rats and birds with snares made from horsehair. That they chewed leather straps softened in river water. Hunger shaped his bones. Loss shaped his eyes. And in the long black of winter, beside a mother, too proud to weep, he learned what it meant to be alone. But from this desolation, he also learned a different kind of strength. Not the strength of position or inheritance, but of watchfulness. He watched how men gathered followers, not just through blood, but through loyalty. He watched how pride could get you killed, and how generosity could earn you a friend for life. He learned how fragile alliances were, and how valuable courage could become when no one else had it. The steppe had no castles, but it had codes. Hospitality was sacred. A guest could not be harmed under a roof that fed them. But betrayals, once committed, never vanished. Revenge was inherited. Grudges passed down like family heirlooms. And so, Temujin became sharp, quiet, calculating. He had no illusions about fairness. He would rise through loyalty, ruthlessness, and timing. As he grew older, he began gathering followers not through force, but through his ability to bind men to him with gifts, with fairness, and with fear. He rescued a blood brother, Jamuka, and rode beside him for years. He married Borta, a woman from a nearby tribe, whose loyalty would remain steady through captivity, war, and ambition. Slowly, circle by circle, Temujin extended his reach not as a Khan yet, but as a man who could be trusted to protect his own and punish traitors. And all the while, the steppe remained unchanged. The wind still blew down from the north like a knife. The herds still wandered. But something stirred beneath the snow and stone. Among the scattered clans of horsemen, stories began to shift. There was a man, they said, who remembered every kindness and every wrong. A man who listened more than he spoke. A man who moved like smoke and struck like fire. He would not call himself Genghis yet, but the plain already remembered his name. They remembered him because he did not disappear. When others starved, he hunted. When others fled, he returned. And when others begged allegiance from those born high, Temujin turned to the forgotten former enemies. Discarded sons, exiles with broken spears and hungering eyes. He welcomed those whom the steppe had turned aside. And in doing so, he built not just a warband, but something new. A kind of loyalty that answered to no tribe and no father's name. It began, as so many things do, with revenge. Temujin was still young when his wife, Borta, was kidnapped by the Merkits, a rival clan still bitter over ancient insults. They came in the night, swift and silent. They took her and vanished. In the frozen morning light, Temujin rode out with a handful of companions and sent messengers to his blood brother, Jamuka, and to a powerful Khan named Togrul. Once a friend of his father's, the old alliances stirred. 3 small forces joined as one, and together, they descended on the Merkits like a winter storm. Borte was rescued, and the message was clear: Temujin would not be ignored. This was the first glimpse of something deeper. He did not just fight for himself. He honored loyalty. He remembered debts. And the men who rode with him began to understand that in Temujin's camp, worth was not tied to birth or name, but to courage and obedience. Those who served him well rose. Those who betrayed him were hunted without rest. But ambition cannot grow forever in secret. Eventually, He and Jamuka clashed not in whispers, but in full battle. Both sought to unite the steppe, but their visions were different. Jamuka clung to the aristocratic traditions of the Mongol nobles. Temujin wanted to break that power, make a meritocracy from the bones of clans. When they met on the plains, their two armies thundered into each other in a fury of hooves, arrows, and grit. Temujin lost that first battle. Jamuka captured some of his men, and in a show of brutal warning, he boiled them alive. But Temujin did not break. He vanished into the folds of the land, regathered his followers, and bided his time. He offered promotions to even the lowest herdsmen who fought bravely. He distributed loot equally, and slowly, those tired of the old ways came to him. Years passed, clan by clan, banner by banner. His influence grew. He struck down traitors with swift precision, yet honored every promise made. His tent became a place of decisions, not decadence. And in 1206, the chiefs of the steppe gathered at a great Huriltai, a ceremonial council of the tribes beside the Onon River, not far from where Temujin had been born. There, he was named Genghis Khan, universal ruler of the Mongols, no longer merely a chieftain. He now stood as the head of a nation, forged not by tradition, but by will. It was a new beginning for the steppes, a unification not seen in centuries. If ever, he had bound men not just by blood, but by law, and he would not stop at the horizon. Genghis Khan did not believe in waiting for threats to come. His enemies had to be broken before they could unite. And so, he turned his gaze outward. The Tanguts of western Xi controlled the lands to the southwest, a border kingdom that stood like a gate between the steppe and China. Though small, they were well organized, and their cities glinted with wealth and stone. Genghis demanded tribute. When they hesitated, he attacked. The Mongol horsemen swarmed like locusts fast. Coordinated, terrifying, the cities fell one by one. Unable to adapt to the sudden speed of mounted warfare, the Mongols did not fight as other armies fought. They did not carry heavy baggage trains or rely on supply lines. Every rider was self-sufficient, with multiple horses, dried meat, fermented milk, and a bow capable of piercing armor at range. They moved fast, struck hard, and vanished before resistance could form. Scouts rode days ahead. Messages traveled by relay, and each unit could operate independently, adapting in real time. With the Tanguts subdued, Genghis now saw opportunity. To the east, the Jin dynasty controlled northern China, a vast, populous region with cities and defenses far beyond what the steppe had known. But Genghis had learned. He hired Chinese engineers and siege experts. He studied wall warfare, adapted his tactics, and taught his men patience, something rare on the steppe. Then, with ruthless precision, he struck. The Jin cities were unprepared. Their stone walls stood high, but their armies were scattered and slow to respond. Mongol troops encircled cities, cut off supplies, and used psychological warfare. Entire towns surrendered before a single arrow flew, their citizens terrified by stories of annihilation. Others resisted and were wiped from the earth. The fall of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was a turning point. Smoke curled from broken gates. Palaces were looted. Resistance, in many places, crumbled. But Genghis was not only a warlord. He was a planner. He did not burn for the sake of burning. He installed governors, collected taxes, and demanded census counts. He opened trade routes, protected caravan, and punished looters within his ranks. His empire, for all its terror, did not collapse into chaos. It expanded and adapted. Roads stretched farther. Languages mixed. Local customs were often preserved, so long as tribute was paid and order maintained. And now, the steppe began to change. Karakorum, his capital, rose slowly in the Orkhon Valley. It was not a city of marble or towers, it was a crossroads. A place where silk met wool, where Buddhist monks debated Nestorian priests, where Persian scribes worked beside Chinese astrologers. Here, Genghis met with foreign merchants, received ambassadors, and refined the systems that would hold his empire together. He introduced the Yasa, a complex and unwritten code of law, preserved by memory and fear. It governed everything from theft and murder to hospitality and military discipline. It mandated religious tolerance, standardized punishments, and created a postal system that could carry a message across continents in weeks. It was harsh, but it worked, and it was here, in this moment of structure and strength, that the Mongol Empire was no longer merely a conquering horde. It had become something else, a state with rules, with roots, with ambition far beyond its grassy origin. But no empire rises without casting shadows. The blood spilled in its birth soaked deep into the ground. The terror it inspired whispered from city walls and caravan roads. And still, Genghis was not finished. The edge of his empire was only ever the start of a new ride. The edge of a Mongol campaign was not a fixed border. It was a horizon. And when Genghis Khan turned toward that distant line once more, he looked west, not into the fading grasses of the steppe, but into the blazing dust and stone cities of Central Asia. The Khwarezmian Empire stood there rich, sprawling, and sure of its own invincibility. It stretched across the Persian lands, into Transoxiana, anchored by merchant cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench. These cities gleamed with tiled mosques, grand libraries, marketplaces fragrant with saffron and almond, and palaces draped in silk. Their rulers held court among calligraphers and astrologers, convinced of their sophistication, their permanence. At first, Genghis offered friendship. He sent a diplomatic caravan westward, loaded with gifts and goodwill, fine cloth, gold, even a letter written in the careful hand of a court scribe. But the Shah of Khwarezm, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, was suspicious. Perhaps he thought it a trick. Perhaps pride clouded judgment. Whatever the reason, he allowed one of his governors to seize the caravan, kill its guards, and claim the goods as contraband. When Genghis sent another envoy to demand justice, they were murdered. This was not merely an insult. It was war. But Genghis did not rush. He prepared. The campaign that followed was not a single strike, but a cascade. In 1219, he led his forces westward, with more organization than most kingdoms could muster in a generation. Tens of thousands of mounted warriors moved in coordinated waves. They crossed the deserts, forded rivers, and broke into the very heart of the Khwarezmian world. Bukhara was the first major city to fall. The Mongols approached quietly, scouts riding wide arcs. When they struck, it was sudden and complete. The gates crumbled beneath their siege machines. The city's defenders were overwhelmed, and its people brought before Genghis himself. According to legend, he entered the city's mosque, stood at its pulpit, and addressed the survivors, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." He did not always speak in metaphor. The city was sacked, Resistance met extinction. But those who submitted, scribes, artisans, engineers, were spared and folded into the Mongol war machine. They would soon serve their new masters, building bridges, casting Ziga weapons, and laying the groundwork for further conquests. Samarkand came next, the jewel of Central Asia. Samarkand's spires rose like blue flames above green gardens. It fell after a fierce siege. Genghis's troops tunneled, starved, and battered the defenders until the gates opened. In its aftermath, tens of thousands were slaughtered. Some say the rivers ran red. Others say they ran silent, choked with silk and bone. What is certain, the city's beauty did not save it. The Shah fled, hunted like prey. He crossed his empire in retreat, fleeing to the edges of the Caspian Sea. Genghis sent a detachment to pursue him across the mountains. Eventually, the Shah died on a barren island, deserted, sick, alone. His empire unraveled behind him. Its cities burned or broken. Its armies scattered into dust. But still, the Mongols moved west. This part of the story is often lost among the larger tales of China or Europe. But it is here in the ruins of Central Asia that Genghis forged the deepest terror of his reign. Not just in conquest, but in precision. He destroyed irrigation systems when resistance was high. He left untouched villages when submission was swift. Cities that resisted were wiped away completely, their names fading from maps. And all the while, Genghis recorded everything. He took censuses, measured livestock, calculated roads, ordered that craftsmen be spared, priests be respected, and taxes be exact. His mind, though born on the steppe, now functioned as that of a ruler of vast diversity. He did not ask his subjects to become Mongols. He asked only that they obey, pay, and do not rebel. A new kind of empire was emerging, from the riverbanks of the Sir Darya to the burned gates of Nishapur. Mongol control was now tied, not just to fear, but to infrastructure. The relay system of the Yam, with post stations and fresh horses, allowed communications to move across thousands of kilometers in days. The roads were watched, the caravans protected. Paper money began to appear, stamped with Mongol seals. And travelers, merchants, monks, even spies began to notice that the roads, once dangereux, now shimmered with possibility. Back in the east, Genghis Khan's sons were proving themselves. Yohui, the eldest, ruled far to the northwest. Chagatai, strict and fierce, maintained order over Central Asia. Ojede, steady and administrative, would eventually be chosen as his father's successor. Tolui, the youngest, watched over Mongolia itself. Each son commanded his own forces, each with autonomy, but all under Genghis's supreme direction. There was tension, especially between Jochi and his brothers, but Genghis kept order through hierarchy, rewards, and the knowledge that disobedience would be answered swiftly. He was not sentimental. When one of his top generals rebelled, Genghis did not hesitate. The man had led Mongol armies, crushed cities, and won victories, but when he challenged authority, he was executed without ceremony. Loyalty mattered more than past service, obedience more than affection. Still, Genghis did not rule with cruelty alone. In places, his empire brought stability. In Persia, he reinstated markets. In Samarkand, schools reopened under Mongol oversight. The roads flourished, and ideas began to cross regions, long divided by war. Buddhist monks debated Sufi mystics. Chinese astronomers taught in cities that once knew only Arabic. A Persian doctor might treat a Mongol commander while quoting Confucian classics. These were not accidents. Genghis encouraged such exchanges. He recognized the value of scholars, of record keepers, of those who knew how to build things that lasted. But even emperors must bow to time. As the 1222nd drew on, Genghis's hair turned gray. Though his strength remained, he rode still, inspected his armies, demanded reports from his governors. And yet, the long years of campaign, the wounds taken in battle, the weight of empire, it pressed heavier. He launched one final campaign against the Western Shah, who had disrespected a summons to war. The cities fell again. The resistance was crushed utterly. It was during this campaign, in 1227, that Genghis Khan died. No one knows how. Some say he fell from a horse. Others say he was wounded in battle. One legend says he was stabbed by a captive princess. Another, more mundane, claims illness took him in the night. Whatever the truth, the news was kept secret at first. His body was returned quietly to Mongolia, likely to the Burkhan Khaldun mountain sacred to him since childhood. No tomb was built. No monument rose. His funeral procession was guarded by soldiers who killed every witness. The land was left untouched. Forests grew. Roads were forgotten. And somewhere, beneath soil and silence, the man who had once ruled from the Pacific to the Caspian was laid to rest. But his empire would not rest. It was only beginning. In the wake of Genghis Khan's death, the empire did not shatter as so many had expected. Instead, it paused just long enough to exhale. Then, as if his breath still lingered in the mouths of his sons, it surged forward once more. The great Hurultai, the council of Mongol nobles, was summoned. Though the news of Genghis's passing had been delayed, the structure he left behind ensured that succession did not come with chaos. His chosen heir had long been named Ogedei. His third son, wise, diplomatic, and even-tempered. Ogedei was not the fiercest of his brothers, nor the most ambitious, but he was, perhaps, the most measured. And in a world now stretching from Korea to the Caucasus, it was this steadiness the empire needed most. The coronation was grand. From the edges of the empire, they came envoys from China, from the Volga, from the Persian cities, still smoking from conquest. Horses lined the plain like rows of wheat. The banners of 100 tribes fluttered against the wind. The name of Genghis was spoken not in mourning, but in declaration. The Khan was dead. The empire lived. Ogedei did not hesitate. He immediately began the work of consolidation and organization. The empire, once fluid and reactive, would now take on the bones of governance. He strengthened the Yam postal system, ordered permanent postal stations, spaced evenly across the steppe and far beyond. Each station was stocked with horses, supplies, and relays of riders, making it possible for information to pass from Korea to Hungary in mere weeks. He minted coins, introduced state salaries, and issued paper currency to be used throughout the empire. These economic measures helped stabilize trade routes and encouraged merchants to travel vast distances under the protection of the Mongol name. The famed Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, was beginning to form, its arteries flowing through the veins of half the known world. But peace was never the end goal. Ogedei, like his father, believed expansion was necessary not for plunder alone, but to maintain the cohesion of the empire. Ambition, after all, kept generals loyal and armies sharp. And so, under his rule, The Mongol war machine moved west again, this time toward Europe. It was not merely a raid. It was a campaign of such scale and scope that the kingdoms of Christendom, long distracted by their own feuds, suddenly found themselves shivering beneath unfamiliar hoofbeats. The campaign was led not by Ogedei himself, but by Genghis's grandsons, Batu, the son of Yochi, and Subutai, the empire's most brilliant general. Subutai was no ordinary commander. He had served Genghis in China, in Persia, in the icy passes of the Caucasus. He saw terrain not as obstacle, but as opportunity. His strategies bent rivers, lured armies into false retreats, struck where least expected. Together, Batu and Subutai led a campaign westward through the Russian steppes, crushing the principalities one by one. Ryazan fell, then Moscow, then Vladimir. The cities burned in rapid succession, and the survivors who limped westward spoke of horsemen who moved like ghosts and killed like gods. By 1241, the Mongols reached Poland and Hungary. European armies scrambled. The Pope sent letters, calling for unity, but it was too late. At the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian army was obliterated. Mongol archers on horseback rained down death, their curved bows outmatching the heavier European crossbows. Their engineers built pontoon bridges in a single night. The Hungarian king barely escaped. Panic swept the continent. In Paris, priests fasted. In Rome, churches held all-night vigils. And then, without warning, the Mongols withdrew. The cause was simple. Ogedei had died. News reached the front through the Yam system, and tradition demanded that all major leaders return for the next Kuriltai to elect a new great Khan. The armies turned east. Not out of mercy, but from duty. Europe exhaled. But the empire's reach was now undeniable. From the Sea of Japan to the banks of the Danube, no region remained untouched by Mongol ambition. Even in retreat, they left behind garrisons, alliances, and the ashes of cities that would take generations to recover. Back in Mongolia, the question of succession loomed again. Ogedei's death opened cracks within the imperial family. His sons vied for influence, as did the descendants of Genghis's other children. The debate dragged on. Years passed. Eventually, after deep negotiation and pressure from multiple factions, Ogedei Nephev Mungke, son of Tolui, was chosen as the next great Khan. Mungke was methodical and deeply devout. Under his reign, the empire expanded yet again, this time turning its full attention to the south, to the Song dynasty in China and beyond, to the lands of the Middle East. He launched massive campaigns against the Chinese heartland, building vast fleets and siege engines with the help of Chinese and Persian engineers. The Mongols had learned well by this point. Their adaptability was unmatched. They could cross mountain passes, navigate jungles, or lay siege to walled cities for months without breaking. But Mungke would not live to see the final conquest of China. He died during a campaign in Sichuan in 1259, either from illness or poison. His sudden death once again halted Mongol expansion and opened the door to yet another succession crisis. This time, the divisions would run deeper. Kublai, Mungke's younger brother, was ambitious, cosmopolitan, and favored by many Chinese officials. But his claim was contested by Arik Boka, another brother, who had the backing of the traditional Mongol aristocracy and the homeland power base. The empire, once unified by conquest, now fractured under the weight of inheritance. The ensuing civil war between Kublai and Arik Boka was not merely a family dispute, it was a cultural turning point. Kublai represented a new vision, a Mongol empire that would root itself in Chinese traditions, bureaucracy, and cities. Arik-Boke stood for the older ways, the nomadic code, the supremacy of the steppe. Kublai won, and with that victory, the empire's center shifted. No longer was the heart of the empire the cold grasslands of Mongolia. It was now the imperial palaces and rice fields of China. But while Kublai ascended, the unity of the empire weakened. The other branches, those of Jochi in the west, Chagatai in Central Asia, and Hulagu in Persia, remained loyal in name, but autonomous in truth. The age of a single great Khan ruling all was fading. Still, Kublai's rise marked the beginning of something new, an empire no longer built on raiding and retreat, but on rule, administration, and imperial grandeur. And so, as the thundering hooves quieted, and a different kind of empire began to take shape, one wrapped not in leather and wind, but in paper, ink, and stone. The man who had once hunted deer on the Mongolian steppe now sat beneath dragon-carved beams in the marble halls of Khanbalik, what the world would later call Beijing. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, did not merely inherit the Mongol Empire. He reshaped it in his image. He had studied Chinese philosophy, admired the civil service system, and surrounded himself with scholars, astronomers, and administrators from every corner of his grandfather's conquests. Where Genghis had ruled with swift justice and fear, Kublai ruled with paperwork, appointments, and the pageantry of court. He was still a Mongol, but his heart beat now in the rhythm of an empire rooted in cities, not saddles. To consolidate power, Kublai first had to secure the south. The Song dynasty, long the dominant force in southern China, still held vast swathes of land, rich cities, and millions of subjects. They had watched the fall of the Jin in the north and prepared carefully. Their cities were fortified with moats and stone walls. Their armies were well trained, their generals seasoned. They had held the Mongols at bay for decades, using terrain and bureaucracy as weapons. But Kublai was patient. He built supply chains. He recruited Han Chinese advisors. He commissioned massive fleets of river ships to support sieges and troop movements. His commanders coordinated amphibious assaults, surrounded mountain passes, and set up long blockades to choke off resistance. The Mongols, once entirely dependent on cavalry, now marched with infantry, dug trenches, and operated catapults beside Chinese engineers. The final push came in 1276. The Song capital of Linan, modern-day Hangzhou, surrendered without a siege. The young emperor, just a boy, was taken into Kublai's court and treated with ceremonial respect. Though his dynasty was effectively ended, a few loyalists held out in the south for several more years, even crowning a new child emperor. But by 1279, the Song were no more. China, whole and unified, now lay under the rule of a foreign conqueror. Kublai declared the establishment of a new dynasty, the Yuan. It was a curious name, Yuan, meaning origin or primal force, was rooted in Chinese tradition, yet it had never been used as a dynastic title. Kublai was signaling something subtle but profound. He was not just another foreign king ruling over China, he was becoming China. He moved the capital from Karakoram to Dadu, later Khambalik, erecting palaces in accordance with Chinese geomancy. He retained Mongol customs at court, but adopted Chinese rituals in governance. The imperial court became a blend of cultures. Mongol warriors in furs walked beside Chinese scribes in silk. Muslim astronomers from Persia consulted with Tibetan lamas and Confucian scholars. Yet beneath the pageantry, Real divisions remained. The Yuan hierarchy placed Mongols at the top, followed by Central Asians and Muslims, with Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. Civil service positions were dominated by foreigners or Mongol loyalists. Though the roads were safe and trade boomed, resentment simmered. But for a time, the empire flourished. The Grand Canal was repaired and extended, linking the rice fields of the south to the imperial tables of the north. Grain flowed steadily to the capital. Tax revenues were collected with bureaucratic precision. Arts, science, and literature bloomed under imperial patronage. Kublai encouraged printing, supported medical research, and maintained correspondence with rulers as far afield as the Mamluk Sultanate and the Papal States. It was during his reign that a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo arrived in the court of the Great Khan. To the Polo family, the empire must have seemed like a dream, vast, orderly, strange, and rich beyond reckoning. Marco would later describe cities with endless canals, caravans stretching for days, and palaces where ice was stored underground through summer heat. He exaggerated, perhaps, but not entirely. For the rest of the world, the Mongol Empire now stood not only as a military force, but as a civilizational crossroads. And yet, power always carries strain. Kublai faced rebellions on multiple fronts. His campaigns to expand into Southeast Asia faltered in the jungles and mountains. Though he succeeded in asserting suzerainty over Burma and parts of Vietnam, these territories remained restive and expensive to maintain. And in the east, he faced his greatest humiliation twice. He launched massive fleets to invade Japan. The first came in 1274. A combined force of Mongols, Koreans, and Chinese troops carried across the sea by hundreds of ships. They landed in Kyushu, defeated local samurai, and pushed inland. But then, a typhoon struck, scattering the fleet, wrecking ships, drowning thousands. Undeterred, Kublai launched a second, even larger expedition in 1281. It was one of the largest fleets in pre-modern history, over 4,000 ships and 100 null soldiers, drawn from across the empire. But again, a massive typhoon struck just as the fleet neared Japan's shores. The storm, which the Japanese called kamikaze divine wind, obliterated the invasion. The Mongol failure became myth in Japan, and a scar in Kublai's pride. He turned his attention back inward. His health declined. His beloved wife and heir died within years of each other. He withdrew from court, gained weight, and fell into depression. In his later years, governance faltered. Corruption rose. The vast mechanisms of the Yuan state creaked under their own weight. Kublai Khan died in 1294. He was mourned not only in China, but across the empire. In Persia, coins bore his name. In Russia, his orders were read with reverence. In Central Asia, roads he had funded still carried traders and pilgrims alike. He was buried with ceremony, and like his grandfather, his tomb was hidden, its location lost to time. His death marked the last time the Mongol Empire was whole. Though the various Khanates still nominally acknowledged the Great Khan, they increasingly ruled as independent realms. The four great divisions, the Yuan in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, drifted apart. Trade continued. Ideas still moved. But the unity of Genghis's dream, once held together by charisma and conquest, now splintered beneath the quiet pressure of time. Still, in the marketplaces of Samarkand, the roads of Yunnan, and the ports of the Black Sea, the echo of that empire remained in languages, in architecture, in laws, and in names written across forgotten maps. Even as the empire fragmented, its arteries kept beating. Caravans continued to wind their way across the vast belly of Eurasia. Silk from Hangzhou still found its way to Aleppo. Lapis lazuli from Badakhshan was carved into jewelry in Cairo. From the forests of Siberia to the courtyards of Venice, Mongol roads remained open. It was an age of unlikely safety, an era when a merchant could ride from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Europe under a single imperial guarantee. This strange and shimmering calm became known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was not peaceful in the sense of stillness or harmony. Wars still flared at the borders. Clashes rose between Khanates. But across the heart of the continent, a thread of continuity held. The Yam postal system still functioned. Relay stations with fresh horses and armed escorts ensured that messages and goods could cross mountains and deserts faster than ever before. Travelers moved through hundreds of ethnic regions and languages. Under the shadow of the same decree, the Khan protects this road. It was during this time that one of the most remarkable Mongol innovations, one not forged in battle, matured into a quiet revolution. Paper money. Though the Chinese had pioneered it centuries earlier, it was under the Yuan dynasty that paper currency became standardized and widely used. The Mongol administration issued banknotes backed by silver reserves and enforced their use with a combination of legal policy and sheer imperial authority. Traders had little choice but to accept the new system. And soon it proved surprisingly efficient. Currency flowed more freely. Trade expanded. Goods could be priced and taxed more consistently across distant markets, and with trade came not only goods, but ideas. Buddhist monks, Christian friars, Sufi mystics, Jewish traders, Confucian officials, they all moved along the same routes, sometimes side by side, sometimes in quiet opposition. The Mongols, famously tolerant of religion, allowed temples, churches, synagogues, and mosques to flourish, so long as they did not interfere with tax collection or imperial loyalty. In the Ilkhanate, centered in Persia, Islam was adopted as the dominant faith under Ghazan Khan in 1295. In the Yuan, Tibetan Buddhism gained special favor, with lamas rising to positions of courtly influence. In the Chagatai Khanate, a tug-of-war between Islam and older shamanic traditions played out across decades. And in the Golden Horde of Russia, Islam eventually became the official faith, blending with steppe traditions and Slavic influences in curious harmony. But it was not only religions that traveled. Technologies moved across borders like never before. Chinese gunpowder found its way to the Middle East. Persian astronomical instruments arrived in China. Mongol military engineering, refined through campaigns in every climate, was studied and replicated. Medical knowledge, agricultural technique, and even culinary recipes passed from one Khanate to another. The Silk Road, long a tangled web of peril and delay, became a living vein of human exchange. But even veins can rupture. By the early 1302, the strains of distance, ambition, and inheritance began to pull the empire apart. The Khanates still traded, still acknowledged a shared origin, but they no longer moved in unison. The Yuan dynasty in China focused inward, increasingly consumed by courtly intrigue and peasant unrest. The Ilkhanate struggled with succession crises. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into smaller territories, and the Golden Horde turned its attention northward. entangling itself with the politics of the Russian principalities. Yet for a few brief decades, the world was more connected than it had ever been before. A scholar in Baghdad could read Chinese philosophy. A monk in Tibet could learn of Aristotle. A merchant from Genoa could speak with a Uyghur interpreter in Samarkand. And all of it, this fragile miracle of openness, was built atop the bones of conquest. It is easy to forget, in the rustle of trade and the hum of caravans, how much blood had fertilized these roads. Behind every mile of safety was a city that had once burned. Behind every market was a population that had once fled. Genghis Khan's empire had been born in ash, and though it now wore silk robes and administered through paper, the echoes of that violence never quite disappeared. Still, travelers marveled. Friar Oderic, a Franciscan missionary, described the Mongol realms with wonder. Muslim historian Rashid al-Din compiled encyclopedias of geography and culture at the Ilkhan court. Even skeptics could not deny the scale, the strange unity, the sheer audacity of a world stitched together by riders from the steppe. But shadows loomed. The roads that carried merchants also carried plague. Somewhere, likely in the rodent-infested grasslands of Central Asia, the Black Death began its slow, deadly creep westward, carried by fleas, rats, and people alike. It moved along the very routes that had once promised safety. As it reached trade ports, the disease spread with terrifying speed first to the Middle East, then to Europe, North Africa, and beyond. By the mid-14th century, the plague had decimated populations from Cairo to Constantinople, from Florence to Samarkand. Tens of millions died. Cities collapsed into panic. Trade routes withered. The very arteries that had once sustained the Mongol order now became its curse. The Mongols were not spared. In China, the Yuan dynasty struggled not only with the plague, but with rebellion. Peasants, burdened by tax and famine, rose in waves. Secret societies formed. Local warlords gained traction. The dynasty, once majestic under Kublai, now teetered under weak emperors and endless unrest. In 1368, the Yuan fell. The Ming dynasty took its place, driving the Mongols back toward the steppe. The last Yuan emperors retreated northward, maintaining a rump state in Mongolia, but never again holding China. Their palaces were burned, their records scattered, the Silk Road flickered, dimmed, and in some places, vanished. The other Khanates, too, began to shrink. The Ilkhanate disintegrated after a succession crisis, leaving a patchwork of Turkic and Persian states. The Chagatai Khanate fractured permanently. The Golden Horde endured longer but faced growing resistance from emerging Russian states. By the late 14th century, the unity of the Mongol world was broken. But in its wake, something remained. In the languages still spoken in markets, from Kiev to Kashgar, in the surnames passed down across steppes and mountains, in the systems of trade and law that outlasted the Khans, the Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, had redrawn the map of the world. And somewhere in the wind, the riders still pass, no longer seen, but faintly heard. Where empires collapse, cultures begin again. As the mighty framework of Mongol governance loosened and crumbled, its bones remained embedded in the earth. Roads continued to guide new travelers. Citadels, built by order of long-dead Khans, became the seats of local rulers. Languages, once carried by decree, turned into Creole tongues blending Persian, Turkic, Mongolian, and Chinese syllables into unexpected harmony. But more than any law or wall, it was the memory of motion that endured. In the former heartland of the Mongol world, the city of Karakorum now stood half abandoned. Once the nerve center of a vast domain, it was little more than a waypoint now, a place of wind and forgotten stones. Yet the steppe itself remained unchanged. The grasses still rolled in waves. The sky still stretched with that same ancient indifference. And in the gurs that still dotted the plains, stories of the past were murmured into the firelight. Stories of Genghis. Of course, his childhood exile, his rise, the thunder of his return, but also stories of Ogeday's silver coins, of Subutay's cunning maneuver, of the vast catapults that hurled death at city walls far from any pasture. These were no longer histories for ruling. They had become histories for remembering. Yet while the Mongol heartland returned to quiet, the outer regions of the former empire continued to evolve in surprising directions. In Russia, the Golden Horde had established a long shadow over the Eastern Slavic world. Though their political dominance faded, their administrative structures had laid a template for tax collection, regional control, and military service that would eventually be adapted by the rising power of Muscovy. The princes of Moscow, once subordinates to the Khans, learned their methods well. They adopted Mongol habits of tribute, of bureaucracy, of military readiness. Even their titles echoed the steppe. And by the 15th century, it was they who turned against the horde. In 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, Dmitry Donskoy's forces clashed with a Mongol army, marking the symbolic start of Russian resistance. Though Mongol rule would persist for another century in fragmented forms, the tide had turned. The rise of Tsarist Russia owed as much to Mongol influence as it did to Slavic tradition. Further south, in the remnants of the Khanate, the vacuum left by Mongol collapse was filled by new empires. The Timurids rose from the ashes, not Mongols by blood, but inheritors of their tactics and symbols. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, styled himself as a second Genghis. He claimed descent through marriage, adopted similar titles, and built his armies on the legacy of steppe warfare. Yet he was also a builder, commissioning dazzling blue-tiled cities in Samarkand, funding astronomical observatories, and sponsoring Persian literature. The legacy of the Mongols was thus not only one of fire but of foundation. In China, after the fall of the Yuan, the Ming dynasty set about restoring Han Chinese rule. They purged the court of Mongol influence, rebuilt the Great Wall, and emphasized native traditions. Yet even the Ming could not erase what the Yuan had left behind. The capital itself, Beijing, remained where Kublai had built it. The Grand Canal continued to serve trade. The postal stations, the census practices, the administrative divisions all bore faint fingerprints of their former overlords. Even Chinese cuisine and clothing retained traces of the Mongol period: lamb dishes, dairy products, and felt garments more common in the north than ever before. In language, too, echoes remained. Words of Mongolian origin slipped into Persian, Russian, and even Turkish vocabularies. Mongol titles, like Khan, Noyan, and Tumen, persisted in military and court systems far removed from the steppe. Genealogies, especially among the Central Asian elite, were proudly traced to the house of Genghis, even centuries after his line had lost real power. The once nomadic empire had, without meaning to, seated roots in the very civilizations it had sought to command. And then there were the people, the descendants. Though the imperial line of Genghis fractured, it did not vanish. His bloodline, according to tradition and DNA, spread far and wide. In Central Asia, Khans and sultans for centuries claimed direct descent from the Great Khan. In India, The Mughal emperors, a name itself derived from Mongol, would rise to build one of the most enduring Islamic empires, blending Persian art, Turkic warcraft, and Mongol heritage. Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, was a descendant of both Timur and Genghis. Even in distant places, the shadow of the Khans lingered. In Korea, royal families who had once married into the Mongol court continued to honor their ancestry. In Japan, memories of the failed invasions endured in legend and military lore. And in the Islamic world, scholars debated the place of the Mongols in history. Were they a divine punishment, a necessary upheaval, a test of faith? By the 15th century, the age of Mongol dominance had passed, but the contours they had carved into the world had not faded. And perhaps the most curious legacy of all was the memory of how they ruled, not through temples, or books, or citizenship, but through trust and fear, through loyalty and swift punishment, through a deep understanding of the land, the wind, the need for speed. Their greatness had not depended on buildings, but on motion. Their empire was built on the back of a horse, and maintained through the relay of breath and hoofbeat across the silent earth. The world they left behind was no longer the world they had conquered, but it was one shaped by them, its lines redrawn, its rhythms shifted, its futures opened. Even now, to trace the path of a trader in 13th century Samarkand, or a scribe in Dadu, or a warrior at the edge of the Caucasus, is to walk in the wake of hooves that never truly stopped echoing. From the outside, the Mongol Empire appeared brutal and singular, an avalanche of horsemen and arrows, devouring kingdoms, leaving only ashes. But within, it contained its own order, a system far more intricate than the clang of conquest could convey. Central to that order was the Yasa, the elusive code of law attributed to Genghis Khan. It was never written down in full, never etched into stone or transcribed into volumes for scholars to consult. And yet, across the Khanates, it ruled with invisible authority, passed orally through commanders and court scribes. It was part legal structure, part ethical code, part strategic doctrine. Its very fluidity made it potent, adaptable to need, yet feared enough to bind disparate lands beneath a single set of expectations. At its heart, the Yasa emphasized loyalty, discipline, and order. Desertion during battle was punishable by death. Theft, especially of horses, was treated with ruthless consistency. A commander could not take another soldier's without permission, nor could a noble abuse his power without facing collective judgment. The Mongol court, often seen as chaotic from the outside, functioned under this unspoken rule that power was earned by loyalty and retained through strict responsibility, but it also protected the practical foundations of daily life. Religious tolerance, for instance, was not merely a matter of policy, it was law. Monks, priests, and imams were exempt from taxation. The Yasa forbade interference in religious worship. No one faith was privileged over another, at least in the eyes of the court. It was not an embrace of pluralism in the modern sense, but a recognition that spiritual authority could coexist with imperial dominion as long as that dominion remained unquestioned. The code also dictated personal behavior. Washing clothes in running water was banned, for fear of polluting a precious resource. Eating in front of others without offering to share was frowned upon. Hospitality was sacred. Guests had to be fed, protected, and respected, regardless of tribe or origin. Even the consumption of food followed rules. Meat had to be cut cleanly, with blood drained in accordance with steppe custom. Wastefulness was despised. A warrior might drink from a shared bowl beside a beggar status. For a moment, dissolved in the rhythms of survival, this cultural discipline extended beyond the court. In the army, formations were rigid, chain of command absolute. The decimal system structured everything. 10 men made a arban, 10 abans atsuun, and so on, scaling up to tumen, units of 10,000. These were not merely theoretical divisions. They moved together, fought together, lived and died under shared responsibility. If one man fled, the entire arban could be punished. If one succeeded, the honor was collective. This structure enabled the Mongols to respond with uncanny speed. Orders could be dispatched across vast distances. Riders galloping from post to post along the Yam system. Messages were written in clear script, translated into multiple languages, and relayed by tireless couriers. A decision made in Karakoram could be known in Tabriz within weeks. It was, by medieval standards, lightning, and where communication flowed, so too did record-keeping. The Mongols, despite their oral roots, embraced administration. Censuses were taken regularly. Tax obligations were catalogued. Lists of professions, blacksmiths, weavers, apothecaries were kept in provincial reports. Imperial clerks, many of them Persian or Chinese, standardized units of measure, compiled legal cases, and managed archives that spanned continents. The empire functioned not just by might, but by ledger, and where the court required clarity, scripts multiplied. The Mongols adopted the Uyghur script as their official alphabet vertical, elegant, and easily adaptable to multiple languages. In China, they preserved local writing systems, but issued imperial edicts in multiple tongues. In Persia, Arabic script remained dominant, but Mongol seals stamped documents with an authority no caliph could contest. This multilingualism was not accidental, it was policy. Interpreters were valued, translators were honored. A general who could issue commands in Turkic, Persian, and Chinese was far more valuable than one who knew only the language of the steppes. The Khan's court became a polyglot space where ambassadors from India waited beside Russian envoys, where a Nestorian bishop might dine beside a Buddhist monk, where conversation moved fluidly across dialects. And then, there was the seal. Each Khan possessed a tamga, an official emblem used to mark decrees and possessions. It was more than a symbol. It was an extension of will burned into documents, pressed into coin molds, emblazoned on military banners. To receive a decree bearing the Khan's seal was to be touched by power itself. Many cities surrendered at the sight of it. Such systems created not just fear, but a strange kind of trust. Merchants felt safe enough to travel again. Scholars dared to correspond. Pilgrims journeyed without constant dread. It was not peace in the modern sense, but it was a kind of predictable order, an empire of momentum and memory, discipline and decree. And through it all, the steppe never disappeared. Even in the grandest courts of China, Mongol rulers kept the symbols of their origin. Nomadic festivals were still celebrated. Archery contests were held in palace gardens. Meat, not rice, was the favored meal. Horses were housed in the shadow of imperial halls. The Khan might rule from a throne, but he was still, at heart, a man of the saddle. The balance between old and new, between felt tent and stone palace, was delicate. But for over a century, it held, and in the long stillness of that moment, between conquest and collapse, the empire found its voice, not in shouts, but in instructions whispered from station to station, in seals pressed onto parchment, in the subtle turning of law into legacy. Far from the battlefields and beyond the boundaries of war, something peculiar bloomed in the heart of the Mongol Empire, a capital city that had no stone walls, no marble gates, no riverside grandeur. It was a city born not of conquest, but of necessity. Its name was Karakorum, set in the Orkhon Valley of central Mongolia. Karakorum did not impress at first glance. From a distance, it looked more like a large encampment than a capital. Its perimeter was marked not by towers, but by wooden palisades. The wide sky loomed endlessly above it, and the wind blew through its streets, as it had for centuries before it. But step closer, and the city unfolded in strange layers, neither entirely nomadic nor fully urban. This was no ordinary city, built by Ogedei Khan, son of Genghis. Karakorum served as the nerve center of an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary. It housed blacksmiths and scribes, merchants and masons, shamans and monks. In its low buildings, one could hear 10 languages before midday. Silk from China, gems from India, glass from Syria, all passed through its markets. At the city's heart stood a curious structure, a silver tree, fashioned by a French silversmith captured during a campaign in Europe. The tree was not a living thing, but a fountain, its limbs hollow tubes through which wine and fermented mare's milk flowed. Golden serpents coiled around its trunk, and beneath its boughs stood 4 lions that poured drinks into goblets on command. It was a symbol not just of wealth, but of synthesis. Metalwork from Europe, drink from the steppes, artistry from the East, all fused under the gaze of the Khan. And nearby sat the Khan's great palace. It was not grand in the manner of Chinese dynasties or Persian courts, but it was imposing in its function. Thick beams supported its roof, covered in black tiles, imported from the south. Within, the Khan received emissaries from distant lands, diplomats from the Pope, traders from Genoa, monks from Tibet. The audience chamber was lined not with gold, but with carefully ordered maps, account scrolls, and decree boxes. Power here was quiet, methodical. What made Karakorum unique was not its architecture, but its rhythm. This was a capital for a mobile empire, a place that understood movement. The city would swell during the summer months when the Kurultai was held and the steppes were green. Then it would fall quiet again in winter. When the court dispersed to warmer regions, the people of Karakorum understood that permanence was not their aim. They built what was needed, repaired what was worn, and left space for the winds to pass through. And yet, even with its modesty, Karakorum became a place of immense coordination. Here, orders were dispatched to distant governors. Tax shipments arrived by caravan and were redistributed. Artisans from every corner of the empire settled here to work side by side. Chinese weavers, Persian calligraphers, Central Asian potters, Russian jewelers. The Mongols valued talent, and in Karakorum, it had gathered in quiet concentration. Religious structures dotted the city without separation. A mosque stood near a Buddhist stupa. A Christian church rang its bells beside a shaman's ritual grounds. The Khan's tolerance was not just theoretical, it was spatial. Karakorum did not segregate its beliefs. It housed them side by side, allowing priests and monks to eat in the same markets, drink from the same wells. Even burial rituals, once strictly tribal, began to adapt. Foreigners who died in the city were allowed rites of their faith. Mongol nobles were increasingly buried with inscriptions, sometimes even tombstones. a shift from earlier traditions of secrecy and anonymity. Memory was becoming formal, not just oral, and Karakoram, though small, was becoming its keeper. The city's geography reflected this blend. To the north, tents, traditional Mongol gers, still sprawled in clusters, smoke rising from their chimney holes, their felt walls fluttering in the cold. To the south, more permanent buildings grew, brick workshops, Khanates, even a primitive observatory. Roads were trodden more than paved, but their courses were deliberate. The city did not sprawl, it unfolded. Scholars came, too. By the mid-13th century, Karakoram had its own scribal school, its own archive of decrees and annals. Historians began compiling the secret history of the Mongols, a narrative of Genghis Khan's life, drawn from memory, record, and reverence. It was more than a chronicle. It was a myth, an origin, a claim to order. Outside the city, the Orkhon River wound its slow way past the ruins of older empires. The valley had once been home to the Uyghurs, the Turks, even earlier civilizations. Ancient inscriptions still dotted the hillsides, carved in forgotten scripts. The Mongols had not erased them. They had simply added their own layer. Karakoram's lifespan was brief in the grand timeline of cities. When Kublai Khan moved the imperial seat to Dadu, Karakoram faded. It was sacked and rebuilt multiple times. Eventually, the stone was carried away. The artisans moved on. The Gurs drifted into the plains again. But the city had done its part. It had been the heart, however briefly, of the greatest land empire the world had ever seen. And even in its quiet decline, it left behind traces. In the 20th century, archaeologists uncovered its remains, tile fragments, broken tools, bones of horses, and scraps of inked parchment. They found the outlines of the Silver Trees Basin. They traced the footprints of workshops, the shadows of wells. The dirt still remembered. To walk in Karakoram today is to walk through layers of sound that are no longer there, hoofbeats fading into wind. Murmured, treaties, carried by messengers, now dust. The creak of a wooden cart headed east toward China, or west to Samarkand. Nothing of the city stands tall now, but beneath the grass, the pulse of the empire still lingers, quiet and enduring, like the long breath of the steppe that once carried its voice. Death came without spectacle, no procession, no monument, no oracle to foresee it. Genghis Khan, the man who had remade the world on horseback, died in the field, as he had lived. The year was 1227, and the campaign against the Western Shah had nearly reached its end. Details of his passing remain elusive, cloaked in layers of myth and silence. Some whispered of wounds from a battle. Others claimed he fell from his horse. Another tale, more poetic, said he was stabbed by a noblewoman from the Tangut court. But the truth, as always with the steppe, lies somewhere between fact and dust. His death was kept secret. For weeks, perhaps months, his generals hid the news. The army pressed on, ruthlessly completing its campaign. The Western Shah were annihilated, Intercité disappear, erased from both map and memory. Only once the campaign had concluded was the truth slowly released. Even then, it traveled carefully, whispered through the ranks, wrapped in reverence. The funeral rites, if we can call them that, were uniquely Mongol. His body was likely transported back to his homeland, perhaps the sacred slopes of Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain he had once hidden upon as a boy. There, in the cradle of his childhood, beneath pine and stone. He was buried in secret. No tomb marked the site. No stele stood above the grave. Instead, legend claims the men who buried him were killed to preserve the mystery. Horses were ridden back and forth across the land to flatten the earth, and trees were replanted to hide all signs. In time, even those who had buried him were buried themselves. And thus began a tradition, the silent burial of the Khans. Secrecy became sanctity. Even century later, when emperors were buried under the Yuan, the exact location of Genghis's resting place remained unknown. It was a fitting end for a man who had rewritten the world without leaving a single stone monument. But death did not still the empire. Genghis had planned too well. His 4 sons, each governing a part of the empire, took up the reins. The division was not one of chaos, but of design. Each prince received an ulus, a realm to govern, rich in pasture and tribute. Ojede, the 3rd son, was named successor. Yohi, the eldest, received the lands to the west, though he died before his father, leaving them to his sons Batu and Orda. Chagatai ruled the central steppe. Tolui, the youngest, held the Mongolian heartland. This decentralization was not weakness, it was momentum. The empire, now stretching from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea, did not collapse under its own weight. Instead, it turned outward again. The sons, and later the grandsons, expanded further still into Persia, Syria, the Russian forests, the jungles of Southeast Asia. Each campaign was different. Each carried the memory of Genghis in its banners. Ojedi, as Great Khan, oversaw the next great phase of expansion. He continued the conquest of northern China, securing vast cities and installing loyal administrators. He launched the Western campaign into Europe. He completed construction in Karakoram, but even he could not rule forever. Ogedei died in 1241, and with him passed the last breath of the original generation. Succession once again stirred debate, and the Kurultai Ever, the anchor of Mongol legitimacy, was convened in careful ceremony. The empire stood at its widest extent, from the shores of the Yellow Sea to the plains of Hungary. A traveler could pass under the banners of a single dynasty. No empire in history had stretched so far, or ruled over so many people of different faiths, tongues, and customs. And still, the mechanisms of control functioned. Postal relays ran. Census counts were taken. Tax caravans moved with precision, but unity, so carefully forged, began to strain. The Khanates began to evolve into their own identities. The Golden Horde in the northwest became increasingly Turkic and Islamic in character. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia blended Persian, Turkics, and Mongol traditions into a distinct rhythm. The Ilkhanate in Persia, led by Hulagu, grandson of Genghis, embraced Islam and Persian court customs. And in China, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai embraced Confucian systems and Buddhist patronage. Each branch bore the imprint of its region. Each remembered Genghis differently. For the Ilkhanids, he was a distant founder, more myth than man. In the Yuan court, he was the great ancestor, honored in temple rituals and royal genealogies. Among the nomads of Mongolia, he remained more immediate, a hero of the steppe, whose name was invoked in oaths, stories, and the rhythms of daily survival. In time, the differences between the Khanates grew sharper. Language diverged. Alliances shifted. The dream of a unified empire under a single great Khan slowly faded. But the idea of Chinggis, as he was known in Mongolian, endured. His laws, though adapted, were still quoted. His strategies, though refined, were studied. His bloodline, though diluted, remained a source of legitimacy across kingdoms, from Delhi to Samarkand. Rulers traced their descent to him like a sacred thread, hoping to claim even a shadow of his strength. And yet, Genghis himself left no writings. What we know of him comes from others, from Persian historians, Chinese court scribes, European travelers, and above all, from the secret history of the Mongols. Composed shortly after his death, it tells of his childhood hunger, his betrayals, his victories, and his solemn oaths. It does not paint him as flawless. It shows his cruelty, his superstition, his pride, but above all, it preserves the pulse of the man behind the empire, a man who, once abandoned in the wilderness, had become the center of the world. His death marked the end of a life, but not the end of movement. Even as his body returned to the mountain, his name continued to ride the wind. It rode with merchants over the Silk Road. It rode with scribes into distant courts. It rode with warriors who never saw his face, but carried his standard into battle. It rode in the prayers of emperors who claimed to be his sons, and in the curses of kings who watched their cities burn. It rode in silence, as all things on the steppe do. When the Khanates gathered beneath the same sky to divide the world, they did not do so in bitterness. Not yet. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan approached the future, as riders might approach a vast and unfamiliar pasture, with caution, calculation, and the memory of their origin. Each of the four great regions, Orulus, would be governed semi-independently, but with shared blood and allegiance. It was a system rooted not in centralization, but in layered trust. The great Khan in Karakoram or Dadu would be the nominal head, and the other Khans, while powerful in their own realms, would recognize his authority, at least in form. For a time, it worked. The Yuan dynasty, led by Kublai in China, was the most visible of the Khanates, wealthy, bureaucratic, and expansive. The Ilkhanate in Persia became a hub of cultural fusion, blending Mongol military rule with Persian artistry and Islamic faith. The Chagatai Khanate, in Central Asia, clung closely to the traditions of the steppe, favoring nomadic law and horse-based warfare. And in the far northwest, the Golden Horde, born of Jochi's lineage, reigned over the steppes of Russia, the Black Sea coast, and parts of the Caucasus. The Golden Horde quickly became a force unto itself, led first by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis. Its presence in the Russian world was not a passing storm, but a long shadow. The horde collected tribute from the Slavic principalities, held political leverage over local rulers, and maintained vast encampments along the Volga River. From Sarai, its bustling capital, administrators wrote in Turkic, kept Persian scribes, employed Russian tax collectors, and consulted with Islamic jurists. Despite its power, the Golden Horde was more confederation than kingdom. It did not enforce Mongol identity on its subjects. Russian princes remained in power so long as they paid their dues. Islamic scholars taught freely in cities like Bolgar and Astrakhan. Merchants traveled without fear. What the horde wanted was order and silver. Over time, the horde itself changed. Originally nomadic, it gradually adopted Islam as its official faith, beginning with the reign of Uzbeg Khan in the early 14th century. Under his rule, the horde embraced Islamic law, built mosques, and funded madrasas. Yet it still clung to the memory of the steppe. Horses were revered. Shamanic rituals persisted at court. And the Khans still judged disputes beneath the open sky. To the south, the Khanates' evolution took a different path. Founded by Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis. The Khanate came into being after the fall of Baghdad in 1258, a moment of profound shock across the Islamic world. Hulagu's forces had captured the Abbasid Caliphate's capital and sacked it with devastating violence. Libraries burned. Scholars were killed. The Caliph himself was executed, rolled in a carpet, and trampled by horses, so that no blood might be spilled. The Khanate was born in fire, but it did not remain a destroyer. Within a generation, it became a center of learning and religious transformation. Ghazan Khan, who converted to Islam in 1295, began the process of integrating Mongol governance with Persian traditions. He adopted Persian bureaucratic models, embraced local architectural styles, and patronized scholars and poets. Tabriz became a glittering capital, with domed mosques and bustling bazaars, its skyline echoing with the call to prayer. Yet even as the Khanate softened its edges, it remained a military power. Its armies skirmished with the Mamluks of Egypt, clashed with the Chagatai Khanate, and contended with the ambitions of rising Turkish beyliks in Anatolia. The idea of a united Mongol empire faded further with each campaign. Though the Khanates shared ancestors, their paths diverged with differing religions, alliances, and identities. The Chagatai Khanate, seated between the Khanate and the Yuan, became the most divided of all. Its territory stretched from the Amu Darya to the Tarim Basin, encompassing deserts, mountains, and oasis cities like Kashgar and Samarkand. It remained deeply rooted in steppe culture. Its khans still held to many of the old ways: open-air courts, nomadic migrations, and reverence for Genghis's memory. But internal divisions plagued it. Factions emerged, some leaning toward Islam, others clinging to shamanism or Buddhism. The western half of the Khanate often feuded with the eastern half. In some decades, it functioned as a single polity. In others, it fractured into a dozen warring fiefdoms. And yet, despite this instability, it produced some of the most beautiful manuscripts, vibrant textiles, and enduring urban centers in all of Central Asia. The Yuan dynasty, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated from its western cousins. As Kublai and his successors embedded themselves deeper into Chinese politics and Confucian bureaucracy, the other Khanates viewed them with suspicion. The Yuan had become sedentary. Some said they had abandoned the ways of the steppe. Their claims of supremacy, once unquestioned, now rang hollow. Still, the Yuan court was immense. Its palaces in Dadu were adorned with jade and gold. The administration ran on hundreds of thousands of clerks. The roads were paved. Grain shipments flowed northward from the Yangtze. The emperor presided over ceremonies that fused Mongol thunder with Chinese formality. But beneath the ceremony, tremors spread. Peasant rebellions stirred in the south. Court factions schemed. Eunuchs and ministers rose and fell with alarming speed. And through it all, the distant Khanates watched. They no longer sent emissaries to the great Khan with gifts of allegiance. They no longer coordinated their military campaigns. The unity of the empire, never fully whole, was now only ceremonial. A distant memory wrapped in ritual. Yet in practice, each Khanate thrived in its own way. They adapted to the lands they ruled, adopted the languages they heard, intermarried with the people they once conquered. Mongol identity did not vanish, it diluted. dispersed, and fused. In the bazaars of Bukhara, a merchant could still buy silks, stamped with the Tamga seal. In the fields near Kiev, tax was still collected, in the name of a Khan. In the valleys of Tibet, Buddhist lamas still carried scrolls bearing imperial edicts written in 4 languages. And in the northern deserts, where no city stood, a man could still sing the stories of Temujin by firelight, just as his ancestors had done. The empire was no longer one, but its spirit, fragmented and reformed, continued to shape the contours of half the world. Westward, they rode again, not Genghis, not Subutai, not the original architects of devastation, but their successors, bearing the same legacy in different armor, under different stars. The Mongol invasion of Europe had begun during Ogedei Khan's reign, a thunderclap in the long silence of the continent's feudal squabbles. It started with reconnaissance, quick raids into the steppes beyond the Volga, testing the strength of Slavic principalities. But by the late 1232, it turned into something else entirely, a full campaign, led by Batu Khan and the legendary general Subutai. They crossed the Volga in winter, their hooves muffled in snow. The sky hung heavy with gray. The forests of Russia, dense and ancient, offered little protection against their speed. Ryazan fell first, then Kolomna, then Moscow. Entire cities were reduced to embers, their churches blackened, their bells shattered. The invaders moved with stunning efficiency. Their siege engineers, Chinese, Persian, and Muslim assembled machines on site using local timber. Their cavalry split into wings, encircling fortresses, cutting off retreat, driving terrified peasants before them. Messages were dispatched in multiple languages. Local princes were captured or killed. The Mongols did not linger. They did not build. They moved on. By 1240, Kiev, the ancient city of the Rus, stood in their path. It fell after a short siege. Chronicles speak of its destruction with awe and sorrow. Monasteries were burned, tombs desecrated. Survivors crawled from ruins, blinded by smoke. Some called it the end of the world. Others, merely the will of the steppe. And still they rode west. The Hungarian plains stretched before them, open and familiar. The Mongols appreciated such terrain, vast, flat, horse-friendly. The kingdom of Hungary, unaware of the storm forming at its border, prepared its knights, confident in steel and crusader pride. But pride had no armor. At the Battle of Mohi in 1241, the Mongols executed a masterpiece of war. They baited the Hungarian army into a narrow corridor between the Saho River and surrounding swamplands. When the Hungarians crossed a bridge, the Mongols let them believe they had a foothold, then collapsed the bridge, trapped them, and encircled their forces with devastating precision. Archers rained arrows from all directions. Heavy cavalry crushed the flanks. Engineers, having built temporary pontoon bridges upstream, struck from the rear. The battle was not simply won, it was orchestrated. The Hungarian army was annihilated. King Bela IV barely escaped. Around the same time, in Poland, another Mongol force under Baidar and Orda relatives of Batu struck Krakow and routed a coalition of Polish, German, and Bohemian knights at the Battle of Legnica. The head of the Duke of Silesia was paraded on a lance. Europe began to panic. Papal envoys wrote frantically. Monasteries held vigils. Kings fortified their castles. But just as the Mongols seemed poised to strike deeper into Germany and Italy, they vanished. Word had come. Ogedei Khan was dead, and according to Mongol law, the princes were required to return for the next Kuriltai. Batu and Subutai withdrew. Europe, confused and grateful, rebuilt. But the Mongols did not forget. They left behind outposts, alliances, and tributary demands. The Golden Horde would rule the Russian steppes for 2 centuries, exacting payment, influencing succession, and watching from afar. Their impact was not only military. In the aftermath of the invasion, surviving Slavic princes shifted their loyalties, adjusting their tribute routes and adopting Mongol administrative practices. Moscow, once a minor settlement, learned how to rise in the shadow of the horde, collecting taxes, enforcing order, and eventually turning those same methods against their overlords. To the south, the Mongols pushed into the Caucasus and Anatolia. Georgia was ravaged. Armenia was subdued. The Seljuk Turks, weakened after their defeat at Kusida in 1243, became vassals to the Ilkhanate. Persian cities, already conquered under Genghis, were now reintegrated into campaigns against Arab rivals. But the deeper the Mongols pushed, the more they encountered new terrain, not just of landscape, but of resistance. In Syria, they faced the Mamluks, former slave soldiers, turned sultans who had built a militarized society, prepared to fight to the death. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, in modern-day Palestine, the Mongols were decisively defeated for the first time in open combat. It was a turning point. The Mongols, long seen as invincible, now appeared human. Their armies bled, their horses tired. The myth of their inevitability cracked, even if only slightly. And while Mongol raids continued into the Middle East for decades, they never again advanced so confidently into the Arab heartlands. The psychological effect of their Western campaigns lingered. In Europe, tales of the Mongols became legends, half truth, half terror. Some believed they were a lost tribe of Israel. Others claimed they were demons sent by God. Their cruelty was exaggerated, their mobility misunderstood, their internal structure barely guessed at. But one belief was universal: they had changed the world. And indeed, they had. Even in retreat, the Mongols had redrawn borders. They had exposed Europe's vulnerabilities, opened new corridors of trade, and laid the foundation for cultural exchange across vast distances. Their cavalry had moved faster than letters. Their scouts had mapped lands no European had dared explore. And their discipline, far from being mindless, had revealed a martial logic as rigorous as any kingdom's. Yet their success in the West was never complete. Unlike China or Central Asia, the lands of Europe did not fall permanently under Mongol rule. The terrain was challenging, the weather unfamiliar, and the cultures too fractured to be easily subdued. Moreover, the internal divisions of the Mongol royal family deepened. Without a strong Great Khan to command unified campaigns, the Western Khanates began to act more independently. Batu returned to Sarai and consolidated the Golden Horde's power across the Russian steppe. His descendants ruled with alternating brutality and diplomacy. Some Khans embraced Islam. Others tolerated the Orthodox Church. Tribute was collected not only in silver, but in loyalty, in troops, in submission, sealed by kiss and coin. Cities like Novgorod, Pskov, and Moscow all negotiated their status carefully, playing the Khans against one another, surviving through taxes rather than swords. The steppe, long a source of invasion, became a political arena. And while Europe would eventually rise again through Renaissance and reform, It would do so in a world fundamentally altered by the riders who had once come and gone without asking. Eastward. The Mongol wave did not crash so quickly it rolled. It eddied. It surged again and again against the great kingdoms of Asia. For here, geography conspired with resistance, and resistance bred endurance. In Korea, known then as Goryeo, the Mongols found their first extended entanglement in East Asia. The peninsula, mountainous and fiercely independent, did not yield easily. The campaigns began under Ögedei, then intensified under Kublai Khan. The Mongols launched invasion after invasion, pressing the Goryeo court to submission. It was not simply a war of blades, it was a war of attrition. Korean cities were sacked. Coastal regions were plundered. Yet the Goryeo kings fled south and established defensive bastions in the rugged hills. Guerrilla fighters harassed Mongol detachments. Entire villages were relocated inland to avoid tribute and conscription. Eventually, the Mongols adjusted. They offered terms, intermarriage, and political leverage. In 1259, Goryeo submitted formally, but retained a surprising degree of autonomy. Royal marriages between Mongol princesses and Korean kings cemented this arrangement. Over time, the Goryeo elite became linked with the Yuan court, serving both as vassals and diplomats, navigating between local resistance and imperial pressure. The result was not conquest in the classic Mongol sense. It was absorption. Mongol customs crept into Korean court life. Mongol-style dress, language, and even horse-based hunting became fashionable among the nobility. Yet Goryeo retained its identity, its language, and its Confucian bureaucracy. It was a compromise, one forged in blood, but sustained by marriage. To the south, the Mongols turned their attention to the jungles and deltas of Southeast Asia. Vietnam, then divided between Darvirt in the north and Champa in the south, proved to be a terrain of resistance. The Mongol campaigns, beginning in the 1252, were plagued by disease, humidity, and unfamiliar tactics. The narrow roads, dense forests, and guerrilla warfare sapped the strength of cavalry-centered armies. In 1257, Mongol forces reached Thunglong, modern-day Hanoi, and captured the city. But they could not hold it. Vietnamese forces, under the Chun dynasty, retreated and struck from the jungles. Supply lines collapsed. The heat and rain wore down even the hardiest Mongol horsemen. Though nominal submission was achieved through diplomacy, true control remained elusive. The pattern repeated in Champa and other kingdoms in present-day Laos and Cambodia. Envoys were sent. Tribute was demanded. When it failed to arrive, armies followed. Cities burned, but then sprang back. Local kings sued for peace, then rebelled once more. The terrain remained a great equalizer. While the Mongols could crush fortified cities and open fields, they could not conquer monsoons or navigate bamboo thickets with ease. In Burma, the Mongols faced the pagan kingdom, an empire of temples and rice fields. Here, the campaign was again one of contradiction. The Mongols entered not as religious destroyers, but as political claimants. The kingdom fractured, not from total conquest, but from economic strain and internal rebellion, spurred by the pressure of Mongol demands. What the Mongols could not hold, they often destabilized. And from these destabilizations rose new kingdoms, some indebted to Mongol rule, others built in reaction to it. In this way, Southeast Asia became a region shaped not by occupation, but by ripple, by the shockwave of Mongol pressure, by the shifting of power centers in response to imperial thunder. Yet nowhere was Mongol ambition tested more painfully than in Japan. The invasions of 1,274 and 1,281 are now legend. Wrapped in the mist of the kamikaze, the divine wind that twice saved the archipelago, the first invasion, modest by Mongol standards, involved about 900 ships and 30,000 men. They landed in Kyushu and met stiff samurai resistance. The Mongols used thunderous tactics, exploding bombs, tight infantry formations, and unrelenting volleys of arrows. The Japanese, used to more ceremonial duels, struggled, but before the Mongols could entrench, a storm struck. Many ships were dashed against rocks. Survivors were slaughtered on shore. The sea claimed the rest. Kublai was undeterred. He ordered a second invasion in 1281 this time. A massive force. Over 4,000 ships. More than 100,000 soldiers from across the empire. Mongols, Koreans, Chinese, Yushin, even conscripts from Central Asia. They gathered in Korea and southern China, launched in waves, and again made landfall in Kyushu. The Japanese had not been idle. They had built coastal fortifications, trained archers, and mobilized samurai across the islands. For weeks, the two forces clashed. Landings repelled, beaches defended, ships boarded and set alight. But again, nature intervened. A typhoon swept through the straits, tearing sails, flipping ships, and drowning thousands. The remnants of the fleet limped home, and the invasion was never repeated. The failure changed Kublai. He had spent vast resources on the campaigns. The Yuan court, already burdened by bureaucracy and court rivalries, began to show signs of overreach. Though Kublai maintained control, the aura of Mongol invincibility dimmed. Japan, untouched by conquest, became a mythic adversary, an island spared by divine will. Back on the mainland, the Yuan administration settled into rhythms of rule, yet the campaigns had stretched the empire. Troops were exhausted. Governors were rotated too frequently. Grain requisitions increased, draining the Chinese countryside. Rebellions flared in remote provinces. Peasant leagues began to organize. Secret societies whispered against the foreign dynasty. And still, Kublai roulette. He turned inward, focusing on court rituals, infrastructure, and grand festivals. His health declined. He withdrew into the pleasures of the palace. His beloved empress died. He mourned in seclusion. The man who had once led campaigns across rivers and mountains now rode only within the garden paths of Khanbalik. When he died in 1294, the Yuan court did not collapse, but it shivered. Succession was smooth on paper but troubled in practice. The empire's roots had grown into the Chinese soil, but its branches had become brittle. Local lords ignored imperial directives. Mongol princes quarreled over precedence. The Jinshi examination system, once resisted, was now demanded by Chinese elites. The court struggled to balance Mongol privilege with Han expectations. And in the shadows, a fire began to burn, not in the north, but in the south, among the rice fields and river towns once ruled by the Song. A movement began to stir, one that would take decades to rise, but would one day call itself the Ming. The sun had not yet set on the Mongol rule of East Asia, but the clouds were gathering, and they smelled of smoke. The man who had once led armies across deserts, rivers, and mountains now lay beneath the earth, his body hidden, but his laws echoing across half the known world. Kublai Khan had outlived his rivals and held together the Mongol dream longer than any might have expected. But his passing in 1294 marked more than the end of a reign. It signaled the quiet unwinding of a vision stitched together by conquest, marriage, and paper-thin unity. In China, the Yuan dynasty continued under his successors. But they were not Kublai. They lacked his authority, his charisma, his vision. They ruled from the great palaces of Dadu, surrounded by eunuchs, officials, astrologers, and foreign advisors. But they no longer rode into battle, nor did they inspire the same loyalty among the nobility. Factions formed within the court. Mongol princes fought each other over precedence and revenue. The Chinese literati, long excluded from the upper echelons of power, began to push back through poetry, through bureaucracy, through underground networks of resistance. The economy, bloated by years of warfare and rebuilding, sagged beneath the weight of endless campaigns, forced labor, and court extravagance. And far from the capital, the countryside whispered. Floods ravaged the Yellow River Basin. Crops failed. Tax collectors, hungry for revenue, pressed harder on already starving farmers. Banditry surged. Religious sects like the White Lotus movement began to mobilize. What began as prayers turned to petitions, then into swords. Rebellion simmered in the 1332nd and 1342nd. Unrest spread like smoke through the southern provinces. One rebellion collapsed, only for two more to rise. By the 1352nd, the Yuan court could no longer deny the reality they were losing control. Entire provinces stopped sending taxes. Local warlords seized grain shipments and blocked imperial messengers. Dadu remained splendid, but increasingly isolated. In the middle of this storm, a former peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang emerged, born into poverty, orphaned by famine. Zhu had spent his youth in a Buddhist monastery. He later joined the Red Turbans, a millenarian group affiliated with the White Lotus, and quickly rose through the ranks. He was charismatic, cunning, and brutal when needed. His army swelled with peasants, deserters, and former officials disillusioned by Mongol rule. Zhu did not merely fight. He administered. He issued land reforms, restored agricultural systems, invited Confucian scholars into his court. He positioned himself not just as a warlord, but as a restorer of moral order, a bringer of light after a century of foreign domination. In 1368, Zhu's forces marched on Dadu. The Yuan emperor, Togon Temur, fled north without resistance. He retreated to the steppe, where he attempted to rule from a remnant court in Shangdu, and later Karakoram. His dynasty, though technically not extinguished, had lost the mandate of heaven. The capital was renamed Beijing, and Zhu declared the founding of the Ming dynasty. It was not just a change in government. It was a purge. Mongol officials were driven out, their laws abolished, their language stripped from documents. Chinese customs were restored. The Great Wall was repaired and extended not merely as a defense against nomads, but as a symbol, a barrier between the world of Genghis Khan and the reborn order of Han rule. And yet, the Mongols did not disappear. North of the wall, in the grasslands of Inner Mongolia and beyond, they remained. The Yuan remnant, sometimes called the Northern Yuan, persisted for decades. Their rule was fractious, sometimes ceremonial, sometimes forceful. They continued to issue edicts in the name of the Great Khan. They dreamed, now and then, of reconquest. but their glory had passed. In the West, the story was similar. The Ilkhanate collapsed in the 1332nd after the death of its last effective ruler, Abu Sa'id. No clear successor followed. Persia fractured into smaller states, some Turkic, some Persian, all jockeying for power. Into this chaos rode Timur, the ambitious warlord from Transoxiana, who claimed descent from Genghis through marriage and wore the mantle of Mongol legitimacy like a well-fitted glove. Timur, or Tamerlane, would carve his own empire through the ruins of the Mongol world, sacking Delhi, burning Baghdad, and leaving pyramids of skulls in his wake. But he was not truly a Mongol emperor. He was something else, an echo of the past, a master of symbols, a violent curator of imperial memory. The Chagatai Khanate, once sprawling across Central Asia, fared little better. It split into eastern and western halves, each ruled by competing factions. Islam became dominant, especially in the West, and many Khans now ruled more as sultans than as steppe nomads. In the Fergana Valley, the seeds of the future Mughal Empire were planted, even as the original Khanate faded into political irrelevance. And in the northwest, the Golden Horde had begun to wither. Internal civil wars weakened its grip. Tamerlane's invasions further destabilized the region. The rise of Muscovy in the 15th century marked the slow reversal of fortune. Russian princes, once tributaries of the Horde, began to assert independence. By the time Ivan III declared Moscow free from Mongol control, the Horde was splintering into smaller Khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, all independent in name, but fractured in practice. Still, in every corner of these post-Mongol realms, the legacy remained. Coinage still bore Mongol script. Roads built during the empire's heyday were used for centuries. Postal systems were adopted by new dynasties. Administrative division, taxation models, and even military hierarchies owed their structure to Mongol precedent. In art, too, the empire lingered. Miniature painting flourished in Persia and India. Styles influenced by Chinese scrolls, brought west by Mongol collectors. In China, Yuan-era ceramics would shape Ming porcelain. In Russia, Mongol yoke influenced centralization. In Southeast Asia, political centers shifted in response to earlier Mongol pressure. And beyond the material, there was something subtler, an inheritance of connectivity. For a brief moment in human history, the world had felt smaller. A letter could cross a continent. A merchant could speak 3 languages in the same marketplace. A scholar from Damascus could read a Chinese text in Tabriz. That memory of interconnection, however brief, did not fade. The empire was gone, but its pathways remained. The storms that had once ridden west with bows and fire now blew quietly through the ruins. Rustling reeds where tents had stood, dusting worn stones with silence. But one must be careful not to mistake quiet for absence. The Mongol Empire had ended. Yes, but its afterlife was long. Across Eurasia, people still lived in the world the Mongols had shaped. Though the Khanates no longer obeyed a central ruler, they had not simply vanished. They had broken into pieces, and from those fragments came new orders, some brittle, some enduring, all haunted by the memory of a time when riders from the steppe had redrawn the world with hooves and fire. Nowhere was that legacy more complicated than in the rising empire of Muscovy, born as a tributary to the Golden Horde. The Grand Principality of Moscow had grown by mimicking Mongol methods. It collected tribute ruthlessly, expanded its influence gradually, and suppressed local rivals with a cold clarity that echoed the steppe. Its princes learned not only from Orthodox priests and Byzantine envoys, but also from Khans and their envoys. The office of Baskak, the Mongol tax official, was eventually replaced by Muscovite clerks. But the model remained. The idea of a single, central ruler Tsar with divine and military authority, to traced back not only to Rome, but to the Khans, even the great Ivan III, the Grand Prince who eventually renounced Mongol overlordship, married Sophia Paleologina of the fallen Byzantine Empire, and took the double-headed eagle as a symbol. But beneath the Byzantine surface, the spine of administration, military service, and regional control owed more than a little to the Mongol yoke. As Muscovy expanded, it absorbed former Khanates, Kazanfel, Astrakhanfel, eventually, even the Crimean Khanate, once the brightest fragment of the Golden Horde, would come under Russian domination. But these were not just victories of force, they were victories of inheritance. Moscow was, in many ways, a post-Mongol empire, retooled and baptized, but shaped by the same logic of tribute, expansion, and absolute power. To the south, in Central Asia, another legacy took root. The successors of the Chagatai Khanate splintered into smaller states, often Turkic in language, Islamic in faith, and still echoing the nomadic traditions of their past. These polities, like the Yarkand Khanate in the Tarim Basin or the Khans of Transoxiana, existed on the hinge between settled and mobile, between Persianate culture and steppe identity, Samarkand and Bukhara, two of the most beautiful cities in the Islamic world, flourished under Uzbek and Timurid rule. Their madrasas, mosques, and observatories bore inscriptions in Persian, but many rulers still claimed descent from Genghis Khan, or at least sought to marry into families that could trace such lines. Legitimacy, long after conquest, still whispered his name. In India, the Mughals carried the legacy even further. Babur, founder of the Mughal Empire in 1526, was a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan through his father from Timur, and through his mother from the Mongol line. His armies crossed the Khyber Pass, bringing Central Asian cavalry tactics into the plains of Hindustan. But he did not come as a Mongol raider. He came as a builder. The Mughals would go on to construct one of the greatest empires in South Asian history. Though Persianate in court culture and largely Muslim in faith, they retained elements of steppe tradition mobility, merit-based military command, and centralized imperial authority. The Mughal emperors built cities, codified law, and blended traditions Turkic, Persian, Hindu, and Mongol. Even the famed Taj Mahal, built by Shah Jahan, stood as a culmination of architectural styles that spanned continents once tied together by Mongol roads. Elsewhere, the legacy took subtler forms. In the Ottoman Empire, which rose in the late 13th century, elements of Mongol military organization and nomadic ethos persisted through Turkish tribes once displaced by the invasions. In the language of diplomacy, the term Khan continued to be used alongside Sultan. Ottoman scribes studied histories of the Mongols, not as foreign enemies, but as a chapter of Turkic ascendancy. In the East, the Ming dynasty worked tirelessly to erase Mongol rule from its memory. But memory, once rooted, is not easily plucked. Though Ming rulers banned Mongol dress and customs, they retained many of the administrative tools introduced under the Yuan standardized taxation zones, bureaucratic codes, and even some of the court rituals. The Great Wall was not only repaired, but reinvented to contain the very people who had once ruled from within. Beyond the walls, Mongol tribes continued their way of life. They did not vanish after the Yuan's collapse. Instead, they adapted. The Oirats, a powerful Western Mongol confederation, established the Dzungar Khanate in the 17th century, a formidable power that would challenge both Qing China and Russian expansion. In the east, the Khalkha Mongols maintained their autonomy until they, too, were gradually absorbed into the Qing. Even century later, under Manchu rule, the Qing emperors styled themselves as Khans of the Mongols, patronized Tibetan Buddhism in part to appeal to their steppe subjects, and maintained a separate administrative system for Mongolia distinct from the Han provinces. And always, the memory of Genghis remained in Mongolia itself. Even as Russian and Chinese powers circled closer, his name was not forgotten. Songs were sung in his honor. Tales passed from grandmother to grandchild kept his life stitched into the identity of the people. In the 20th century, under communist regimes, open veneration of Genghis Khan was suppressed, seen as nationalist and reactionary. His statues were torn down, his legacy buried beneath ideology. But silence does not erase. When Mongolia regained its independence from Soviet influence in the 1992, the memory of Genghis Khan returned not as a whisper but as a chorus. His face appeared on currency. His statue rose tall in Ulaanbaatar. His name was once again spoken with pride. He was no longer merely a conqueror, he was a founder, not of destruction, but of identity. Across Eurasia, from the cracked mosaics of Samarkand to the fur-lined tents of Inner Mongolia, that identity still lingers, a memory not only of war, but of connection, of a world where the horse could carry a message farther than any ship, where paper, ink, and iron rode side by side. An empire may fall in a season, but a legacy, if woven into breath and earth, can last 1,000 years. In a world stitched together by hoofbeats and echoes, the memory of the Mongol Empire survived, not in stone or parchment, but in practice, woven quietly into the behaviors of people who no longer saw themselves as Mongols at all. Take, for instance, the rhythms of trade. The Silk Road, long predating the Mongol Empire, had once been a disjointed network of regional paths, fragile, intermittent, and perilous. But under the Mongols, it had become a highway of astonishing consistency. The Pax Mongolica had seen to that safe passage across deserts, armed relays along dangerous stretches, even official passports Paisa, granting the bearer imperial protection, even after the empire fractured. The road remained, though no longer overseen by a single Khan. The routes endured, from the spice traders of India, to the silk merchants of China, to the Italian sea captains of Venice and Genoa. Goods continued to flow. Letters in Arabic, Mongolian, Chinese, and Latin passed through hands that no longer remembered their author's common ruler. The system outlived the men who built it, and the traders adapted. In the Mediterranean, merchants from Venice and Pisa established semi-permanent colonies along the Black Sea, and in ports like Tana and Kaffa, they learned to negotiate with Khans, princes, bishops, and bandits alike. Their silver coinage, mixed with Chinese ingots. Contracts were drawn up under dual systems, Mongol and European law, side by side. But trade was not the only current that lingered. Ideas flowed just as freely, if not more so. Arabic astronomy reached China through Mongol intermediaries. Chinese printing technologies trickled westward. Persian medical texts were translated into Turkic dialects. Buddhist monks carried sutras not only to Mongolia, but through Mongolia, into Russia, into Korea, even into distant pockets of Central Asia, where the wind still whispered in a dozen forgotten tongues. The Mongols had never required uniformity. That had been their genius. They did not force their gods upon others. They did not tear down temples unless resistance demanded it. Instead, they watched, they learned, and sometimes, they preserved. In doing so, they became facilitators of one of the most profound periods of cross-cultural fertilization in human history. You can see it in the art. In Persia, miniature painting blossomed under Mongol patronage. Chinese brushwork fused with Persian narrative. Dragons curled around Quranic verses. Buddhist motifs appeared in manuscripts bound for Baghdad. In China, theater expanded in complexity and popularity. Some scripts bearing traces of Persian storytelling patterns. Even Mongolian music, a tradition of throat singing, bowed instruments, and nomadic lullabies absorbed Persian melodies and Chinese harmonies. Carried across the grasslands by imperial musicians, Afanvar, that most terrible of legacies, was changed. Gunpowder, already known in China, found new roles in the West. Siege techniques developed by the Mongols were studied in both Islamic and European texts. Mongol cavalry formations, disciplined, flexible, and devastating, became the envy of military theorists from Cairo to Prague. And while many remembered the terror of the Mongol onslaught, others remembered the precision. They remembered that a Mongol army moved not like a mob, but like a living organism, coordinated, responsive, and terrifying in its calm. This discipline reshaped how states thought about their own militaries. It wasn't enough to have brave men. One needed orders, ranks, drills. One needed the vision of an empire that could turn chaos into momentum. But perhaps the most invisible inheritance of the Mongol world lay in the structure of governance. Mongol Khans had ruled over dozens of ethnicities, each with its own traditions, laws, and faiths. To manage this, they developed systems of layered authority, local governors answering to regional lords, who in turn bowed to the central court. Autonomy was granted so long as tribute flowed, and rebellion did not. This model was not unique to the Mongols, but their scale refined it. Later empires, from the Ottomans to the Mughals to the Romanovs, would apply similar models. Tolerance in exchange for loyalty, customary law beneath imperial law, bureaucracy upheld by record keepers, translators, and tax agents who could cross borders without crossing lines. The Mongol postal system, too, left deep trace. The yam relays of fresh horses and lodgings spaced across the empire had once carried orders from Karakorum to Kiev in weeks. After the empire's fall, its ghost lingered. Postal routes continued in Persia under later dynasties. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible adopted a similar system. In China, the Ming modified Yuan infrastructure rather than demolishing it. Communication, once slow and uncertain, had been recalibrated, and so too had scale. Before the Mongols, few had imagined a single political system stretching from Korea to the Caspian. After the Mongols, it became thinkable. Even if such vast empires often fell apart, the very possibility had entered the human imagination. The dream of world-spanning dominion, of universal rule, so central to Timur, to the Ottomans, to Napoleon, to others, owed much to the precedent set by Genghis Khan. Not by his cruelty, but by his reach. Even a century later, the maps drawn in Europe still bore traces of Mongol cartography. Cities once obscure like Karakoram, Samarkand, and Tabriz now featured prominently. A mental geography had been remade, not just for scholars, but for states, and in language, too. The fingerprints remained. The word horde, derived from the Turkic Ordu, entered Western usage through the Mongols. The term Khan passed into Slavic tongues and Turkic courts. Even in India, where Mughal became a shorthand for imperial grandeur, the echo was clear. The title Padishah, though Persian in origin, gained new weight under rulers who styled themselves heirs to the house of Genghis. Yet for all these enduring legacies, the people themselves, the nomads of the steppe, returned to a quieter existence. As global powers shifted toward maritime empires and industrial capitals, the grasslands faded from central maps. The caravans grew fewer. The horses, once the lifeblood of an empire, became symbols rather than engines. But the songs remained. In Mongolia, in Kalmykia, in Buryatia, singers still gather around fires to chant the deeds of Chinggis. Not with the violence emphasized by foreign chroniclers, but with the reverence of descendants. They tell of a man born into hardship, who rose not just through strength, but through vision. A man who, however cruel, bound the world together, if only for a moment. And the wind that moves over the steppe, it carries those songs still. On the endless grassland, where the sky presses so close to the earth that it feels like it might fold downward and swallow the horizon. The memory of empire never truly leaves. It lingers not in borders, nor in flags, nor even in bloodlines, but in the shape of things, in the curve of a tent flap, in the sound of hooves pounding frozen ground, in the discipline of riders who do not turn their backs to the wind. As the centuries moved on, the Mongols remained, no longer rulers of the world. They became something subtler, carriers of tradition, holders of a rhythm that the world had tried to forget. The steppe still held them, quiet and open, and they, in turn, held on to a way of life that no amount of empire, collapse, or occupation could quite erase. In the lands of modern Mongolia, life slowed again. After the fall of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol court retreated to its ancestral homelands. The great cities of the empire, Beijing, Samarkand, Baghdad, slipped from their hands. But in the valleys and hills of the Khentai and Kongai ranges, Khans still ruled. Tribes still met under open skies. The jar was still pitched against the wind, and goats still circled the fires as elders recited the secret history from memory. These Mongols, the northern Yuan, continued to claim the title of Great Khan, but their influence was limited, their unity fragile. Feuds broke out between clans. Local nobles jockeyed for power. Sometimes they allied with the Ming dynasty. Sometimes they raided its northern frontiers. Other times, they warred among themselves over grazing lands and family honor. Their power flickered strong in some generations, barely surviving in others. Yet what they preserved was something deeper than sovereignty, a cultural continuity. Nomadism, adapted to each century's pressures. Enduret, herding, hunting, archery, and wrestling remained central to daily life. Shamanic rites persisted alongside Buddhism. Genghis Khan, once an emperor feared across continents, was remembered not as a conqueror, but as an ancestor. A shepherd of destiny who had honored the spirits of the mountain and the horse, even under foreign rule. The Mongol soul remained elastic. When the Manchus rose in the 17th century and established the Qing dynasty, they, too, saw the necessity of Mongol loyalty. They did not seek to destroy Mongol identity. Rather, They absorbed it. The Qing emperors took Mongol titles, joined in steppe rituals, married into elite Mongol families. They allowed the continued rule of hereditary khans under the banner of the Qing, even as they tightened administrative control. In return, many Mongols served the Qing as cavalrymen, border guards, and regional governors. And yet, this was the beginning of the long pause. The great, open distances of the steppe began to close in, not from conquest, but from bureaucracy. The rhythms of grazing and migration were slowly fenced by maps, tallied by tax ledgers, and interrupted by envoys from faraway capitals. Still, the Mongols endured on horseback, in song, with prayer wheels spinning beside ancestral stones. In the west, other echoes remained. The Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other Turkic peoples of Central Asia had long mingled with Mongol bloodlines and traditions. Their khans, their tribal structures, their genealogies often led back to Genghis. They, too, moved with the seasons, hunted with eagles, passed judgment beneath trees instead of roofs. But with the arrival of Russian expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries, even these highlands and deserts began to change. The Russian Empire, recognizing both the symbolic and strategic power of the steppe, moved steadily to incorporate it. Fortresses were built. Railways etched new lines across old pastures. Orthodox missionaries and Russian settlers altered the demographic landscape. Yet even as Central Asia was carved into provinces, the legacy of Mongol rule remained surprisingly durable. Kazakhs and Uzbeks continued to trace noble lineage through Chinggisid descent. Regional Khanates, like Bukhara and Khiva, maintained court customs, reminiscent of Mongol days down to the horsehair standards and the structure of official ranks. When the Russians dissolved these Khanates, they did so with reluctance. Aware of the spiritual authority they still held over their people, the transformation accelerated with modernity. In the 20th century, both Mongolia and the broader steppe were caught in the grip of global ideology. The Soviet Union, determined to forge a new future from steel and slogans, sought to suppress the past. In 1924, the Mongolian People's Republic was declared the world's second socialist state. Genghis Khan was branded a symbol of feudal tyranny. His name was stripped from textbooks. Monasteries were closed. Lamas were purged. The ancient order of sky, horse, and hearth was threatened, not by invasion, but by erasure. But memory proved resilient. In secret, songs were still sung. Elders still passed on stories. Hunters still whispered prayers before riding into the hills. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1992nd, Mongolia emerged as a new nation, but one eager to reclaim the legacy it had been forced to forget. Statues of Genghis Khan rose once more, first in Ulaanbaatar. Then across the country, schools taught his campaigns. His face returned to currency. His image became a unifying symbol, not of conquest, but of resilience. He was a shepherd of unity, a builder of law, a father of a people who had never bowed for long. And beyond Mongolia's borders, others remembered him too. In China, the Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region preserved many traditions, festivals, languages, music. In Kazakhstan, museums displayed artifacts from the Mongol period, not as relics of domination, but as foundations of culture. Even in the Kremlin, historians acknowledged the Mongol yoke not as a simple oppression, but as a force that had shaped Muscovite identity. In the world of letters, new scholarship emerged. Historians re-examined the empire. not just through the lens of its violence, but through its infrastructure, its tolerance, its astonishing adaptability. Genghis Khan, once dismissed as a barbarian, came to be viewed as one of history's most effective state builders, his policies ahead of their time, his vision continent-wide, and in the quiet places in yurts pitched on the high plateau, in valleys untouched by tarmac, in temples where bells still chime with wind, the steppe whispered his name as it always had, not with grandeur, but with familiarity. For to be Mongol is not to ride forever at the head of an army. It is to carry the memory of rhythm, of responsibility, of sky above and earth below. Where laws were spoken in breath and broken only by thunder, the empire was long gone, but its heartbeat steady, ancestral, and echoing across the plains remained. By the time the modern world had fully arrived with its asphalt veins, electric grids, and satellite-bound whispers, the Mongol Empire had long since faded into the mist of distant memory. And yet, like the faint hoofprints of a horse crossing frozen earth, the traces remained. Not in monuments, those could be toppled. Not in archives, those could be burned. But in the less visible currents that shaped how states governed, how peoples moved, how cultures folded into one another without losing themselves. To understand the quiet persistence of the Mongol imprint, one must begin by recognizing how thoroughly they reimagined the idea of empire not as a single center of power, but as a fluid constellation of loyalties. The Khans understood that control was less about walls and more about motion, less about conversion and more about cohabitation. These principles, long after the empire's collapse, remained useful in an age increasingly marked by complexity. In global diplomacy, the Mongol precedent for multi-ethnic administration became a model, even if unconsciously so. The Ottomans employed similar systems in their millet structure. The British Raj leaned on native princes and indirect rule. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, with its endless bureaucracy and careful balancing of ethnic groups, echoed something of the Mongol strategy: divide by identity, rule by hierarchy, unify by tolerance. And on the level of ideas, the Mongol contribution was subtler still, by linking East and West, not just by war, but by administration. The Mongols proved that civilizations long thought to be alien to one another could, under shared conditions, interact meaningfully. The blending of Islamic, Confucian, Buddhist, and Christian realms during the Pax Mongolica showed that culture was not a closed garden but an open plain. The very existence of a European in Yuan China, Marco Polo, serving in an imperial capacity, would have been unimaginable in most other historical contexts. And yet, under the Mongols, such a thing was routine. Muslims served as financial administrators in China. Chinese artisans worked in Samarkand. Persian doctors healed Khans in Karakoram. The empire, however brutal its creation, was in some ways a crucible of unexpected coexistence. The paths it opened, both literal and metaphorical, were not easily closed. European curiosity about the East, once awakened by travelers who rode the old Mongol roads, never truly dimmed. The age of exploration that followed, carried by ships rather than horses, owed a conceptual debt to those who had proven that it was possible to map the world by stringing together the unknown. In that sense, Genghis Khan's empire helped reorient the human imagination from a world of isolated valleys and jealous kings to one where everything could, in theory, be reached. It made global thinking possible, and in a deep, almost geological sense, that idea stuck. In time, new empires would rise: British, Spanish, Russian, American. They built railroads, governed continents, and spread their languages across oceans. But none would ever quite replicate the astonishing speed, brutality, and cohesion of the Mongols. They had done what few others could: unify the heartland of Eurasia without destroying its soul. And perhaps that was their oddest legacy of all, that in the age of iron and blood, their most enduring gift was not fear, but fusion. The fusion of networks, trade, diplomacy, culture, that would centurer la terre, underpin the very notion of globalization. In Mongolia today, reminders of that past are not cloaked in nostalgia, but woven into the everyday. Children still learn to ride before they can write. Archery competitions draw crowds in the summer sun. Grandparents speak the name Chinggis with neither reverence nor embarrassment. It is simply part of the air they breathe. Atnadam, the great midsummer festival of Mongolia. The three manly sports, wrestling, horse racing, and archery, are not commemorations of violence, but celebrations of identity. Each horse that gallops across the steppe carries more than a rider. It carries history. The world looks on, often with curiosity, sometimes with misunderstanding. But the Mongols, for all their influence on world history, have rarely demanded recognition. Their greatest victories, after all, were not written in treaties, but in tracks left across the soil. And perhaps that's why their story lingers so strongly, because it doesn't depend on statues or speeches. It survives in motion, in the sway of a saddle, in the whistle of an arrow, in the beat of a drum across the spine of a mountain. Even the structure of modern Eurasian geopolitics owes something to the lines first drawn, sometimes in blood, by Mongol rule. The corridors through which oil flows, fiber optic cables stretch, and freight trains travel often mirror old caravan paths once protected by Khans. The BRI China's modern Belt and Road Initiative echoes, knowingly or not, the same dream of East and West, stitched together by will and infrastructure. Where once the Mongols built stone relay stations, now rise concrete freight hubs. Where once envoys bore Pisa pendants of authority, now come shipments bearing customs codes and barcodes. The technologies have changed. The impulse has not, and so we live, all of us, in the shadow of an empire that most have forgotten. We benefit from its experiments, its bridges, its cautions. The empire is gone, but it taught us, perhaps more than any before it, how to stretch the skin of humanity across distance without breaking. In the end, maybe that is the true weight of Genghis Khan's legacy, not as destroyer, not as father of nations, but as the first to truly sense that the world could be gathered in one palm, if only for a breath. And even now, as the stars turn over the steppe, someone out there is riding between yurts, wrapped in wool, eyes squinting into wind that smells of horses and smoke, not chasing empire, not remembering conquest, just living as they always have. The sky still spreads, uninterrupted, the grass still bends, and the past, like a distant rider on the edge of the plain, watches without speaking. There's a silence particular to the steppe, not absence, but a presence so vast that sound becomes shy in its company. The kind of silence where history hums underfoot, and even the wind carries a memory. It is here, in this open world of sky and grass, that the final chapter of the Mongol Empire drifts not with finality, but with dispersion. Long after the last banners fell, and the final Khan submitted to another power, the identity of Mongolness did not shatter, it scattered, like embers borne off in different directions. It flickered in unexpected places. In Kalmykia, far west of Mongolia, A strange outpost of steppe culture took root. The Kalmyks, descendants of Oirats, who had wandered across Central Asia, settled along the Caspian Sea in what is now part of Russia. Here, a Mongol-speaking, Buddhist people survived, surrounded by Slavs, Cossacks, and Tatars. For centuries they held fast to their tongue, their rituals, and their gods. Even as regimes shifted above their heads like changing cloud patterns, even today, the Kalmyks remain Europe's only Buddhist majority people, a quiet echo of empire where most would not expect it. Far to the east, in Inner Mongolia, Mongol culture persisted within China's changing political landscapes. While the Yuan dynasty had ended centuries before, the people did not vanish with it. They remained on the land, continuing to speak their dialects, herd their animals, perform their ceremonies, and hold the memory of Chinggis Khan as something living. Chinese governments throughout history, from Ming to Qing to modern-day PRC, handled this inheritance with alternating curiosity, suppression, and patronage. Schools taught Mandarin, but families whispered Mongolian lullabies. State media downplayed the empire, but local festivals raised its banners again. In the folds of hills, beyond the reach of slogans, the Mongol steppe endured, sometimes hidden, sometimes proud, but never gone. And then there were the Tatars, not Mongols by blood, perhaps, but shaped by Mongol rule as surely as iron bends to heat. After the conquest of Kiev and Rus, the Golden Horde settled in the western steppe, blending Turkic and Mongol traditions into new identities. From these roots, the Tatars, Bashkirs, Nogay, and others grew nations within nations, each carrying fragments of the old empire within their law, language, and lore. The Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimea all claimed Chinggizid heritage, and though eventually absorbed by the Russian Empire, their elites retained the memory of Khanates, their tombs shaped in domes, and their lineages recited in poems. Even Ivan, the Terrible, when he took Kazan, had to do so through siege and cunning, as though the ghosts of Mongol generals stood behind the walls. Across the Muslim world, too, the memory persisted. Timur Tamberlane to the west rose in the 14th century, not as a Mongol, but as a man deeply invested in Mongol legitimacy, though not a direct descendant of Genghis. Timur married into the line, flew banners in Mongol style, and ordered the building of monuments that echoed the design of Karakorum and Samarkand. His empire, based in Central Asia, styled itself as a successor, its ruler, not innovator, but heir, and so it went successors after successors. Khans without empires, empires without khans. In South Asia, the Mughals, whose name derives from Mongol, rose in the 16th century, led by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan. Though Persianized and Islamic in style, the Mughal dynasty kept the idea of Chinggisid authority alive in court etiquette, genealogy, and martial tradition. Their empire was one of gardens and marble domes, but behind the scent of roses was the dust of the steppe. The Mongol legacy had become hydra-headed, splintered into art, ritual, myth, and memory. Some remembered the Mongols as destroyers, and justly so. Cities razed, libraries burned, populations scattered. But others remembered them as unifiers, lawgivers, even protectors. In Armenia, Mongol rule brought an end to brutal Seljuk invasions. In Georgia, Queens negotiated complex alliances with khans who, though pagan or Muslim, treated their Christian counterparts with strategic respect. It was never one thing. That, perhaps, is why the story remains so large. The empire itself disappeared, but its meaning expanded, no longer confined to maps. The Mongol name became something else, an inheritance used, misused, revived, and reinterpreted across centuries. In fiction, they took on mythic dimensions. In operas and epic poems, Genghis became a symbol of wrath and ambition. In the West, he was caricatured, sometimes villain, sometimes noble savage. In the East, his figure became more nuanced pragmatist. Lawgiver, father of a people. Hollywood gave him a sword. Museums gave him a codex. Scholars gave him footnotes. The people of the steppe gave him a horse, and in that horse lies the truest legacy. For to ride still matters. In Mongolia today, equestrian sports are not hobbies, they are lifelines to identity. A child who can shoot from the saddle is not merely athletic, they are Mongol. Competitions are held not for spectacle, but for continuity. The bow, the gallop, the shout, they are not performances, but prayers. Each hoofbeat is an answer to the question history never stops asking: what survives? The Mongol Empire is gone. Its capitals are dust. Its lines on the map erased. Its army disbanded. And yet, its weight is in the spine of the continent. Its name is in the wind. Its memory rides still low, steady, and silent. There is no last battle in this story. No great flame, extinguishing the empire in a final breath. No solemn trumpet to close the age of Khans. Instead, the Mongol Empire, so sudden in its rise, so violent in its expansion, ended in slow disintegration. Not with collapse, but with fading, fragment by fragment. It dissolved. The once united world order, held together by horses and fear, and 1,000 stations of the Yam courier system, unraveled into separate Khanates, each now sovereign, each increasingly absorbed by the lands they ruled. The Golden Horde in the west fragmented into smaller Khanates. The Ilkhanate in Persia imploded under internal strife and economic decay. The Chagatai Khanate fractured along tribal and Islamic lines. Only the Yuan dynasty in China held fast for a time, but even it, encircled by rebellion and bureaucratic sclerosis, would fall to the Ming. The fall was not dramatic. It was not even always visible. Merchants continued to ride the Silk Road. Couriers still bore messages across the steppe. But the unifying force behind them, the idea of an indivisible Mongol imperium, was gone. What remained were regional powers, speaking the same ancestral tongue but not the same commands. In Persia, the Ilkhans had already converted to Islam, blending into the administrative fabric of the region. In China, the Mongols had adopted many Han practices, and the Yuan court had begun to mirror that of the Song they had conquered. By the end of the 14th century, Genghis Khan's vision was no longer a political blueprint. It was legend. The decline came not through military defeat, but entropie. The very vastness of the empire, once its strength, became its undoing. With no fixed capital, no codified bureaucracy spanning all regions, and a reliance on personal loyalty over institutional resilience, the empire could not maintain coherence beyond its second and third generations. Plague accelerated the unraveling. The Black Death swept across Asia and Europe in the 14th century, carried in part by the very trade routes the Mongols had secured. What they had united, disease now leveled. Cities emptied. Caravans halted. The economic arteries of the empire clotted. Fear replaced movement. Even the Yam relay system, a marvel of speed and coordination, fell quiet in places. And as the administrative centers weakened, local identities reasserted themselves. Turkic dynasties rose in Central Asia. The Russians, long vassals to the Golden Horde, began to resist. Muscovy, in particular, emerged not just as a survivor, but as a contender. Its princes increasingly defiant of tribute, its armies bolder. In 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, Dmitry Donskoy struck a blow against the horde that, while not fatal, marked a shift in tide. In China, the Ming rose on the promise of restoring native rule. Zhu Yuanzhang, a former monk and rebel leader, declared himself the Hongwu Emperor in 1368, expelling the Yuan and forcing the remnants of the Mongol court to retreat north. Thus began the period of the Northern Yuan, a memory of empire clinging to the high steppes, no longer shaping the world, merely surviving within it. And yet, despite its political dissolution, the Mongol Empire's influence remained curiously durable. Language shifted. But customs endure. Borders changed. But trade persisted. Scholars in Samarkand still referenced Persian works composed under Mongol patronage. Architects in China still built using techniques introduced during the Yuan. Even in Europe, the legacy of Mongol efficiency logistics, espionage, postal systems filtered quietly into statecraft. No tomb of Genghis Khan was ever found. Legends claim that after his death, his funeral escort slaughtered all witnesses, then themselves, and that a river was diverted to hide the grave forever. Whether true or not, it suits the nature of the empire immense. Invisible, potent Ava, in absence, perhaps that is the most fitting epitaph, the empire that vanished, not by dying, but by becoming too large, too interwoven, too absorbed to trace. It became the soil, not the flag. And so the world moved on. But every so often, a new empire, Ottoman, Russian, British, would rise and look back across the centuries to that vast steppe, seeking guidance or warning. Some admired the Mongols' speed, others their terror, a few their administrative pragmatism. Many simply feared what unity of that kind could mean. Today, the Mongol Empire is no longer a threat, but it is also no longer just history. It is myth, memory, and momentum. It is a reminder of what the human will can forge when untethered from borders. It is a cautionary tale of conquest and an inspirational story of endurance. It is, at once, the terror of the past and the curiosity of the future. In Mongolia, a statue of Genghis Khan rises 50 meters tall, astride a silver horse, eyes scanning east across the grasslands. It is not nostalgia, it is acknowledgement. A man, a name, a force, who once reshaped the known world not for a year or a lifetime, but for generations. Beneath that vast sky, under stars older than any empire, the ground still remembers, not in monuments, not in books, but in the quiet curve of hoof marks beneath new grass, in the way a rider adjusts his reins at dawn, in the wind that sounds, just barely, like a whisper of orders shouted across centuries. The empire is gone, but the rhythm continues. And now, as the world settles into stillness and your breath begins to slow, let's step gently from the saddle, lay down the bow, and unfasten the old leather armor. Let the sky arch overhead, silent and endless. Let the grass fold back over the trails of time. For even in silence, the story rides on. And now, with the final embers of the Mongol campfires fading into the night, let your body soften as if the wind has passed through it. Let the story settle into the gentle terrain of your thoughts broad, quiet, unhurried. You've traveled across mountains and steppes, from thunderous conquests to quiet returns. And now the horizon draws no more lines. Only peace. The camp is quiet. The horses sleep. The warriors no longer ride. What once galloped across continents now fades into memory, into song, into stillness. Feel the weight of history dissolve around you. Like old armor removed at the end of a long march, breathe in the cold, clean air of the eternal blue sky wide. Weightless, timeless. The stars above hang like quiet sentinels over a world that no longer remembers what it feared. Let your muscles relax. Let your thoughts grow sparse, like tents scattered on the steppe. And let sleep come like the distant sound of hooves steady. Familiar. Fading. You are safe now. Where no empire can find you. Just wind. Just grass. Just silence. Drift there a while. No more war councils. No more drums. No more maps. Just rest. In the hush of a world once ruled by riders, but now ruled by dreams. Sleep well. Little Khan. Sweet dreams.